My Star Empire. This video is purely for entertainment and does not infringe on copyrights or laws. The rights to the novel and image belong to the original author. We do not claim ownership. Don't like waiting and want to listen to this fanfic in full now? Subscribe to our Patreon, where you'll find the best fanfics. Chapter 676, First Meeting with the Queen Mother. While the new Mantises were fighting with the Zerg, Li Mingze and Xiaoluoluo quietly controlled Li Mingze's warship to dig underground. The 5 tentacles on the warship had now turned into a shovel-like structure, shoveling soil and gravel to the rear of the warship through continuous rotation. After a sound of drilling, the huge body of Li Mingze's warship disappeared on the ground, leaving only a bottomless pit and some soil and gravel on the ground. Li Mingze judged that the Zerg Queen was likely to be hidden in a certain area in the center of this planet, and as long as he continued to dig, he would definitely find the Zerg Queen. After digging downward for about 10 minutes, Li Mingze suddenly felt that the warship stopped rotating, and its drilling shovel seemed to have dug a layer of hard shell. Li Mingze wrapped himself with the tentacles and came from the warship to the hard shell he dug. The surface of this hard shell was a material similar to glass, and under this layer of material was a layer of crimson carapace. Li Mingze thought for a moment and decided not to alarm the enemy. He continued to control the battleship to go deeper along this layer of carapace. Finally, after 3 hours, the battleship dug a large passage that could accommodate hundreds of thousands of Zergs at the same time. And this passage is the structure connected to the inside of this layer of carapace. Judging from the area of this carapace that has been discovered so far, Li Mingze estimated that this planet only has a thin layer of rock and soil on the surface, and in its center is a Zerg mothership the size of a planet. After leaving the battleship outside the passage, Li Mingze and Xiaoluoluo jumped off the battleship and began to walk to the depths of the planet's underground. Following this underground passage that they didn't know what it was for, Li Mingze and Xiaoluoluo groped forward little by little. The two held their breath and were always alert to the situation around them, fearing that the Zerg Queen would accidentally notice their arrival. But they didn't know that in the depths of the darkness, a pair of eyes were staring at the two people intently. And at the core of this planet, the Zerg Queen was looking at the two people approaching on the screen with a sneer on her face. Li Mingze and Xiaoluoluo had no idea that they had already fallen into the surveillance of the Zerg Queen. The two were still moving forward cautiously. All the Zerg troops that might meet them along the way were mobilized elsewhere by the Queen. She wanted to see in person what the difference was between the two Zergs that had escaped her control. She didn't want this to happen again in the future. A few hours later, Li Mingze and Xiaoluoluo came to a semicircular central hall. Above the hall were crystal stones that flashed white light. And around the hall were deep passages that led to nowhere. But just as Li Mingze and Xiaoluoluo walked into the hall, the passages around the hall were instantly blocked by tentacles extending from the ground, and then these tentacles quickly turned from soft to hard. When these tentacles were completely hardened, the entire hall became a closed space. If the two still didn't understand that the Zerg had caught them in the urn, then the food they had eaten for so many years would be in vain. A red figure slowly descended from the top of the hall to the center of the hall. Behind this figure were dozens of tentacles extending from the ceiling. You two are the little bugs who betrayed our Zerg race, right? A red figure gradually walked out from the shadows. She walked slowly and calmly towards Li Mingze and Xiaoluoluo. It was obvious that she did not take them seriously. At this time, Li Mingze could already see the appearance of this red figure clearly. This was a tall and plump woman. But because the woman's face was hidden behind a layer of bone armor, he had no way of knowing her true face. However, from what she said, this person must be the Zerg Queen. I didn't expect that the Zerg Queen actually got a human body. Don't you want to destroy humans? It's really ironic, Li Mingze sneered and mocked. Huh? From your tone, you are not our Zerg? Could it be that you are the product of the civilization called the Sith Empire? The Zerg Queen frowned slightly, secretly surprised. The tone of the insect seemed to be on the side of humans. It seemed that this was not a simple Zerg rebellion. Behind this incident, there might be some conspiracy planned by the Sith Empire. You will never know the truth. Before Li Mingze finished speaking, he exerted force with his legs and instantly rushed to the side of the Zerg Queen. The bone blade in his hand chopped down heavily at the Zerg Queen. Although it was a hasty battle, the Zerg Queen's reaction was very quick. She evaded a bone blade attack by Li Mingze with a clever dodge. At the same time, several bone spurs extended from her hand and stabbed Li Mingze fiercely. Li Mingze used his left-hand bone blade to push the bone spurs stabbed by the Zerg Queen aside, and chopped up the bone blade in his right hand again. Just when the bone blade was about to hit the Zerg Queen's head, the Zerg Queen's head suddenly twisted into a strange bend, and directly avoided the bone blade chopped by Li Mingze. Li Mingze frowned slightly. He ignored the fact that the body of the Zerg Queen was not made of ordinary human bodies. Who knows what was inside her body? He could no longer judge the attack method of the Zerg Queen with common sense. Of course, Li Mingze was not a human body either. He could also change the form of his body at will. After the Zerg Queen dodged Li Mingze's knife, a bone spur of more than 3 meters long suddenly bulged out of her belly, but Li Mingze's knife had already used up all the strength, and it was too late to withdraw his strength to dodge. Although he tried his best to twist his body to avoid it, he only moved a few centimeters away. The bone spur went straight through his waist, and a large piece of flesh and blood on his waist was taken away in an instant. If it were an ordinary person, he would have been seriously injured and lost his combat effectiveness or even died at this moment, but Li Mingze's body had long been homogenized, and he no longer had any weaknesses. There was only one way to destroy him, and that was to blow him into pieces. In just a few seconds, Li Mingze's waist had returned to normal, and the part pierced by the queen had grown back. Oh, the queen was slightly stunned. Although the Zerg also had the ability to recover, it was the first time she had seen someone grow back in a few seconds. Li Mingze didn't say much, and directly picked up the bone blade again and rushed towards the Zerg Queen. But this time he learned his lesson. He focused his attention on the whole body of the Zerg Queen, paying close attention to all her changes. Chapter 677 Playing. As expected, at the moment when he swung the knife, 2 bone spurs suddenly grew out of the arm joints of the Zerg Queen, and the 2 bone spurs stabbed directly at his shoulders. However, Li Mingze, who had already observed this, instantly controlled his shoulders to concave downwards, and the 2 stabbing bone spurs went straight through the concave. After Li Mingze dodged the bone spurs attacking his shoulders, his facial muscles twisted, and a plasma cannon shot from the petal-shaped launch poured on his face to the head of the Zerg Queen. The face of the Zerg Queen instantly turned into bone armor to block the plasma shells. However, what she didn't expect was that Li Mingze's chest suddenly opened several big mouths again, and 4 plasma shells were fired from the big mouths at the Zerg Queen again. The Zerg Queen hurriedly turned all the parts in front of her body into shields to block these plasma shells. But what she didn't notice was that one of Li Mingze's arms had quietly stretched behind her and turned into a huge flower bud. "Goodbye, Zerg Queen," Li Mingze smiled strangely, and then activated the plasma cannon in his hand. The Zerg Queen was frightened by Li Mingze's strange smile, thinking that this guy must have some conspiracy again, so it's better to avoid him first. But just when the Zerg Queen wanted to dodge, her body was instantly submerged by the plasma cannon, and when the blue light of the plasma dissipated, only a pile of debris was left. "Did we kill the Zerg Queen?" Xiaoluoluo, who was watching the battle on the side, came forward and stood beside Li Mingze, looking at the wreckage on the ground and muttered in disbelief. After all, this Zerg Queen was killed too easily, and she didn't feel the horror of the Zerg Queen at all. Not only that, when Li Zhangyang was fighting with the Zerg Queen, not a single Zerg rushed in. Li Mingze also frowned. Indeed, this Zerg Queen died a little too quickly, and it was really easy for him to kill her. At this moment, a sharp whistle suddenly came from the upper end of the hall. Before Li Mingze and Xiaoluoluo could react, a red figure fell from the sky and rushed towards Xiaoluoluo. In the shocked and horrified eyes of Li Mingze and Xiaoluoluo, a bone spur with a diameter of 10 centimeters and a length of more than 2 meters fell from the sky and nailed Xiaoluoluo to the ground. This bone spur went directly into Xiaoluoluo's chest and came out from the tail of the spine. Xiaoluoluo choked twice, and a stream of blood flowed from the corner of her mouth. Although her body had swallowed the genes of the alien, she did not swallow the initial cells of the Zerg, which also caused her body to not be homogenized, and each organ still performed its own function. This made it possible for her to die from organ damage when she was severely injured. The cells in Xiaoluoluo's body began to replicate continuously, and they wanted to repair the injuries suffered by this body. The dark green blood flowed from Xiaoluoluo's wound along the bone spur to the floor and sank into the ground. On her wound, countless granulations grew wildly, and her wound began to heal little by little. "Why, you didn't think you were going to kill me like this, did you?" The Zerg Queen reappeared in the hall, chuckling at Li Mingze. "This is impossible. Did I just kill your clone?" Li Mingze clenched his fists angrily. He thought of his ability to create split people. and he didn't know if this queen also had this ability. If she had this ability, then was this one also her clone? Li Mingze didn't have time to think about it, because the Zerg Queen had already caught a falling bone spur from the air and rushed towards Li Mingze again. Li Mingze panicked and used the bone blade on his arm to block the stabbing bone spurs. The bone blades and bone spurs kept colliding, leaving white scratches on the surface of the two people's bodies. A few minutes later, Li Mingze found a flaw again and blasted the Zerg Queen into debris with a plasma cannon. Just as he was thinking about whether he had really killed the queen, the frivolous laughter of the Zerg Queen came from above the hall again. Li Mingze immediately stacked his bone blades nervously to block his chest. As expected, a bone spur suddenly shot down from the air and hit Li Mingze's two bone blades. The huge force came from Li Mingze's arms, causing him to be directly pressed to the ground, and the bone blades in his hands all began to deform from the middle. However, this did not affect Li Mingze's combat effectiveness at all. He shook his hands and the two bone blades became semi-solid. After returning to their original state, they hardened again and became bone blades. Interesting, but I don't know how long your ability can last. I haven't encountered such an interesting toy for a long time. The Zerg Queen laughed twice again. Anyway, the battle on the ground is coming to an end now, and the rebel army has been completely wiped out by her. How many substitutes do you have? Li Mingze raised the bone blade in his hand and shouted to the queen unwillingly. There are only a few billion left. Ho ha ho ho. The Zerg Queen covered her mouth and laughed twice and continued to rush towards Li Mingze. Seeing this, Li Mingze gritted his teeth and went forward again. What followed was an endless fight between the two. After a few minutes, Li Mingze found an opportunity to chop off the head of the Zerg Queen, and then chopped it into pieces. However, before he could catch his breath, the body of the Zerg Queen fell from the sky again. Li Mingze could only rush forward with his knife again. Li Mingze killed the Zerg Queen every few minutes, and the Zerg Queen would appear again as soon as she died. After hundreds of times like this, Li Mingze finally felt tired and began to feel that his physical strength was gradually running out. After a long period of high-intensity fighting and his continuous repair of his body, the energy stored in his body was finally running out. He didn't know how long he could hold on, and he didn't know whether the Empire would take this opportunity to launch an all-out attack on the Zerg. He just wanted to be reborn with Xiaoluoluo when he was resurrected. Thinking of this, Li Mingze turned his attention to Xiaoluoluo, who was pierced on the side. At this time, Xiaoluoluo was motionless, and she was probably in a coma. The flesh on her body actually began to grow along the bone spear that pierced her. It was obvious that Xiaoluoluo's body had discovered the abnormality in her body. After finding that the wound could not be repaired directly, it planned to wrap up and digest the object that pierced her. Ha ha ha, what's wrong? Do you want to die with your little lover? I'll satisfy you. The Zerg Queen saw Li Mingze's fatigue, and landed lightly in the middle of the hall and walked towards Li Mingze and the others. Chapter 678 Plan Success. The Zerg Queen landed lightly in the center of the hall and walked towards Li Mingze and the others. I will fight to the last moment. I don't believe that you really have countless clones. Li Mingze gritted his teeth and said to the Zerg Queen. Really? You probably don't know that this planet is actually my real body. The ones you just killed are just small pieces of flesh that I randomly split from my body. Didn't you notice that the bodies of me you killed are gone? They have actually been reabsorbed by my real body, the Zerg Queen said and chopped her arm directly. The stump that fell to the ground was suddenly wrapped by the floor and swallowed into the ground. Li Mingze looked at the Zerg Queen, who was constantly walking towards him, and suddenly felt that his vision began to blur. He understood that the Zerg Queen had already discovered them since they landed on this planet. And the Zerg Queen had been playing with the two of them in her hands. Ha ha ha, give up, you guys. The Zerg Queen was talking and suddenly paused, and her face began to change drastically. No. You can't. The Zerg Queen's face became worse and worse, and she began to speed up and rush towards Li Mingze's position. Li Mingze hurriedly cheered up and put two bone blades on his chest. He had to protect Xiaoluoluo behind him. However, the Zerg Queen's footsteps suddenly stopped again while running, and the whole person fell to the ground. No. 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 The Zerg Queen's substitute turned into a pool of sticky liquid with a scream. Li Mingze put away the bone blade in confusion and walked to the pool of liquid and touched it with his hand. He didn't understand why the Zerg Queen suddenly seemed to go crazy, and then turned into a pool of unknown liquid. At this moment, the hall where Li Mingze was suddenly began to shake violently, and tentacles rose from the ground and waved in the air. After waving in the air for a while, These tentacles turned into liquid like the queen's substitute and fell to the ground, splashing Li Mingze. Then the ground in the hall began to surge like waves, and the hard floor began to soften. After a while, it completely liquefied, and Li Mingze's legs began to sink into the ground. The glowing crystals on the ceiling also began to fall off, and one by one, the crystals fell to the ground and splashed water. Li Mingze used the remaining energy in his body to generate an anti-gravity organ for himself, and his body gradually floated in the air. At this time, the ceiling of the hall had also begun to melt, and drops of red viscous liquid dripped from the ceiling. Li Mingze tried his best to dodge these huge water drops in the air. Suddenly he remembered that Xiaoluoluo was still nailed to the floor, but when he looked at the ground anxiously, he found that Xiaoluoluo's body had been swallowed by the floor. Damn it, he gritted his teeth and jumped, diving into the liquefied floor. But just as he was about to drill under the floor, the originally liquefied floor suddenly hardened, causing Li Mingze to fall on the hard floor. Damn it! Damn it! Li Mingze used the bone blades in both hands to try to dig the floor where Xiaoluoluo disappeared. But this floor has become something unknown, so hard that even Li Mingze's bone blade can't cut it, leaving only a shallow scratch on it. Zhang Yang, stop attacking! At this moment, Xiaoluoluo's voice suddenly rang out in the hall. What happened? Where are you, Xiaoluoluo? Li Mingze stood up and looked around in confusion. After being swallowed by the floor just now, the alien genes in my body played a role. It helped me to erode the body of the Zerg Queen. Now I am trying to seize control of the body of the Zerg Queen. She is not far from death, Xiaoluoluo's voice echoed throughout the hall. Delusion. How can you weak humans control my body? Suddenly, the voice of the Zerg Queen, which Li Mingze was familiar with, came from the hall. It's not up to you whether you can do it or not, Xiaoluoluo's voice rang out again. When I take back control of my body, you all have to die. The Queen's voice began to lose some strength. Li Mingze could clearly sense from her voice that the Zerg Queen might have lost the upper hand in this physical battle. I have now taken control of half of her body, and now she has lost control of the Zerg swarm on the ground. Xiaoluoluo's voice sounded again, and now the hall has returned to normal, and the crystals were stuffed back into the ceiling by tentacles. After about an hour, the Zerg Queen's voice did not appear again, and the whole hall suddenly fell into silence. Xiaoluoluo? Are you still there? Li Mingze shouted anxiously to the empty hall around him. But the hall was still silent, and Xiaoluoluo's voice did not appear. Xiaoluoluo, Li Mingze shouted again unwillingly. Suddenly, a human face appeared on the wall of the hall, and Li Mingze recognized that this face was Xiaoluoluo's face. I have successfully seized control of the Zerg Queen's body, and now she has been completely eliminated by me. Xiaoluoluo's voice came without any emotion. Li Mingze was sensitive to the change in Xiaoluoluo's voice at the first time. His excitement for destroying the Zerg Queen became a little uneasy. This body seems to suppress my emotions. I am trying to reshape its internal structure and organs. Xiaoluoluo seemed to know Li Mingze's doubts and continued to explain, but his voice was still cold. At the same time, the swarm of insects on the ground seemed to be suddenly fixed in place, and all the Zerg stopped moving. After a few seconds, the insects on the ground began to fight each other, and they frantically gnawed their companions around them. Because the spirit of the Zerg Queen disappeared, these Zerg lost their existence to restrain them. They have now lost their reason, and their body's instincts control them. They began to only know how to devour food. At this time, the Zerg warships in orbit also began to aim at each other, and bone spurt shells and plasma shells gushed out one after another. This situation not only occurred in the star system where the Zerg Queen was located, but the Zerg in the entire galaxy fell into chaos. The Zerg on all the planets were caught up in fighting each other, and had no time to care about the Imperial warships that were coming. The Imperial officers were also confused. They didn't understand why the Zerg started to kill each other. Was this a conspiracy of the Zerg, deliberately pretending to be in strife to attract their fleet to go deeper? Chapter 679, Victory in War. Although the Empire is good at using conspiracies, it has also been tricked by the Zerg several times, causing the officers of the Empire to be particularly careful, fearing that they will be tricked by the Zerg again. However, when Tianyi even knew about this situation, they guessed that Li Zhangyang and Xiaoluoluo's plan was successful. Since the Zerg have lost control, there is no doubt that the Zerg Queen should have been dealt with by Li Zhangyang and Xiaoluoluo. Although it is not known how they dealt with the Zerg Queen with such a small force, the facts are there. However, It is not ruled out that Li Zhangyang and Xia Luoluo have actually fallen into the hands of the Zerg Queen, and the Zerg Queen has mastered the entire plan of the two. In this way, the Zerg melee at this time is very likely to be a trap. But it would be a pity not to take advantage of such a good opportunity. If the Zerg recovers if this opportunity is missed, it will be bad. Therefore, Tianyi decisively ordered all the warships of the Empire to come out in full force and launch a full-scale attack on the Zerg's defense line. At this time, there was basically no resistance on the Zerg's defense line, and all the Zerg were caught in a fight. The Imperial fleet easily defeated the Zerg fleet in space. When the Imperial fleet arrived, these Zerg warships had already been seriously injured in fighting each other. The same was true for the Imperial Marines. When the Imperial Clone Corps airdropped to various planets, the Zerg soldiers on the ground had already lost 8 or 9 out of 10 and the rest were still killing each other. With the help of mobile fortresses such as mecha tanks, the Zerg, who had lost their numerical advantage, were quickly flattened by the Imperial Clone Corps. In just a few days, the Zerg defense line retreated dozens of light years. The Imperial fleet was unmatched and brave, and the Zerg fled wherever it went. This situation lasted for a full month until a high-level Zerg killed enough subordinates and successfully advanced, allowing herself to unlock the genes of the Queen Mother in her body, which stabilized the Zerg swarm. However, this new Queen Mother who came from behind was not inherited from the Zerg Queen Mother. She did not inherit the memories and knowledge of the Zerg Queen Mother for tens of millions of years. Although the new Queen can control the Zerg swarm, she does not use tactics or create new Zerg species. After a brief hesitation, the newly born Zerg Queen summoned all the Zerg troops to retreat. The Zerg on the ground boarded the battleship Worms and began to evacuate, and the Zerg on one planet after another was cleared. These retreating Zerg troops gathered together in the star system of the new Zerg Queen, forming a mighty fleet and began to withdraw to the periphery of the galaxy. The new Zerg Queen knew that her side had no chance of winning. Instead of staying here and fighting with her last few men, it would be better to lead the troops to develop in a new galaxy. The original Queen in this galaxy had been devoured by someone, and it was too dangerous to stay here. The person who devoured the Queen had mastered all the knowledge and memory of the Queen, and she, the new Queen, was definitely not able to contend with her. What's more, there was a Sith Empire watching covetously on the side. So the new Zerg Queen decisively took all the troops and started to run away. The Empire also discovered the Zerg's movements, leaving half of its troops to sweep the occupied areas, and all the remaining warships were sent out to pursue the new Zerg Queen and her fleet. A few days later, the Empire's fleet arrived at the star system where the Zerg Queen once lived. At this time, Mingze was reorganizing his troops on Xia Luoluo, who had become the size of a whole planet. Until a dreadnought escorted by dozens of Zeus-class ships fell from the sky. Lieutenant General Li Zhangyang. I am Chadley, the special envoy of the Imperial Royal Family. I have been ordered to invite you to return to the Empire to attend the medal ceremony. A handsome young man walked down from the deck of the dreadnought, came to Mingze, stood still and saluted. Lieutenant General? When did I become a Lieutenant General? Mingze asked in confusion. In view of your heroic performance in the Zerg battle, the Empire has promoted your rank to Lieutenant General, and has also prepared silver and gold medals for you to express your gratitude for all you have done, the young man answered respectfully with his chest puffed out. Excuse me, where's Major General Xia Luoluo? She also needs to attend the medal ceremony. The young officer looked around and didn't see Xia Luoluo, so he hurriedly asked Mingze. I'm here. Xia Luoluo's figure emerged directly from the ground of the planet. She has completely mastered her new body and can create clones like the Zerg Queen. Major General Xia Luoluo, please return to the Empire with me and Lieutenant General Li Zhangyang. I will tell you about the medal ceremony later. The officer made a gesture of invitation. Mingze nodded and pulled Xia Luoluo onto the deck of the dreadnought. By the way, don't do anything to this planet. Remember, anything. Mingze shouted to the Imperial soldiers who had just landed on the planet before the deck closed. Don't worry. I will pass on the order later. There will be no mistakes on this planet. The young officer nodded in response. Now he vaguely knew that this planet was probably Major General Xia Luoluo's body. After the dreadnought was lifted off, it directly started the hyperspace engine and disappeared into the starry sky. Half a month later, Mingze and Xia Luoluo followed the dreadnought back to Shenzhou. When the dreadnought slowly landed from the sky, the Imperial soldiers and staff who had been waiting on both sides of the landing deck began to cheer. After the propaganda of the Imperial Propaganda Department, the entire empire knew about the two imperial heroes named Li Zhangying and Xiao Luoluo. In order to win the war for the empire, these two people voluntarily gave up their human identities and became members of the Zerg, and lurked in the heart of the Zerg, successfully penetrated into the Zerg and defeated them. The empire was able to solve the threat of the Zerg like a landslide and drove the Zerg out of this galaxy. Peace was ushered in for the entire galaxy. This is a historic victory. In the battle between the Empire and the Zerg, there has never been such a brilliant victory. The Zerg was once forced to leave their own galaxy, so the victory of this war is of epoch-making significance. Therefore, not only were there many Imperial soldiers and staff who came to welcome them, but the square of the medal awarding ceremony of Kidian Ring World was already filled with excited Imperial citizens. Li Mingze and Xiao Luoluo boarded the transportation boat used for internal transportation of Shenzhou and flew to Kidian Ring World with a farewell of the crowd. At this time, a huge platform stood in the center of the square in front of the palace of Kidian Ring World. The people who were eager to see the heroes had already been waiting in front of the platform. At this time, they had received the message that the two heroes were about to arrive. The people in the square were excited and couldn't help shouting loudly, "Heroes, heroes!" Amid the deafening shouts, the transportation boat that Li Mingze and Xiao Luoluo were riding began to slowly descend. Chapter 680 Rejection. Let's welcome the heroes of the Empire, Li Zhangying and Xiao Luoluo. The host's voice rang out from the center of the platform. Amid the cheers of the crowd, Li Mingze and Xiao Luoluo stood together in the center of the platform. Next, Our Majesty Tianyi and Her Majesty Eva will present the gold medal, silver medal, and black iron medal, which represent the highest honors of our empire, to Lieutenant General Li Zhangying and Major General Xiao Luoluo. The host waved his hand, and the solemn imperial national anthem suddenly sounded in the square. The people in the square stood in awe, their eyes fixed on Li Zhangying and Xiao Luoluo in the center of the platform. At this time, two heroic royal guards walked out from the backstage to the sound of the national anthem. They wore white gloves and held a long box containing the imperial medal in their hands. They walked neatly to one side of the platform. The boxes in their hands were neatly stacked with three triangular medals of different colors. When the two stood still, Tianyi and Eva took out the first black iron medal from the box with a smile on their faces and stood in front of Li Mingze and Xiao Luoluo, and personally put the medal on Li Mingze and Xiao Luoluo's chest. Soon, Li Mingze and Xiao Luoluo had three shining medals on their chests. Thank you for your contribution to the Empire. Every citizen of the Empire will remember it in their hearts. You two are really great. Finally, Tianyi patted Xiao Luoluo's shoulder in appreciation. Long live the Empire. Li Mingze and Xiao Luoluo saluted handsomely and showed the medals they had won to the people in the audience. Warm applause suddenly rang out under the platform, and people shouted passionately, "Long live the Empire! Long live the Empire!" Tianyi and Eva smiled and watched the two people from the side. Li Mingze looked at Tianyi and Eva, who stood in front of him but had no idea of his true identity and wanted to laugh. As long as he didn't say it himself, I'm afraid no one would think that he was the emperor of the empire. But he didn't know that Tianyi had already confirmed his true identity through soul scanning. However, in order not to interfere with Li Mingze's thoughts, Tianyi and Eva did not intend to expose him. Lieutenant General Li Zhangying and Major General Xiao Luoluo, have you two ever thought about turning back into humans? The Empire can perform body replacement surgery for you. Tianyi looked at the Zerg-style bone armor on the two and asked them. Okay, I've long been dissatisfied with this Zerg body. Li Mingze nodded. His aesthetic sense as a human has been deeply rooted, so Li Mingze is not interested in his current appearance. Your Majesty, I agree too, Xiao Luoluo hurriedly echoed on the side. Although her original body is powerful now, she is still a girl's heart after all. That planet-like original body is also not to her appetite. After all, no one wants to become a big meatball. Okay, I will arrange for you to undergo body replacement surgery and help you return to human beings as soon as possible. Tianyi was greatly relieved. 10 days later, several experimental ships of the Empire arrived at the star system where Xiao Luoluo and Li Mingze were. Today they will undergo surgery here to transform from Zerg back to human. In fact, if you want two people to reincarnate, it is very simple. Just kill the two people's bodies, and they will naturally be reborn in the surrounding babies. However, in this way, the Empire will lose the opportunity to study the body of the Zerg Queen, which may be very disadvantageous to the Empire's future war against the Zerg. Therefore, several experimental ships of the Empire slowly descended from orbit with huge needle-like devices hanging. The huge needle-like devices were inserted into the body of this huge planet from the holes opened on the surface of Charlotte's body. These needle-like devices will directly transfer Charlotte's soul to the body of the clone created by her original genes. Li Mingze will only perform the operation after Charlotte's transfer is successful, and he will stay with her until Charlotte succeeds. Just after the Imperial fleet transferred all the equipment needed to Charlotte's body, the transfer operation began. A hibernation chamber containing Charlotte's clone was hung from the spacecraft to the ground. Lieutenant General, please get on the spaceship first. After all, we don't know whether the body of the Zerg Queen will go berserk after the soul is transferred. An officer walked to Li Mingze and advised softly. The officer admired Li Mingze very much, so he didn't want Li Mingze to encounter any danger. No, I'll wait here. Li Mingze shook his head. Okay, please pay attention to safety. The officer didn't want to interfere with Li Mingze too much. After a military salute, he turned around and boarded the spaceship. Soon, only Li Mingze and Xiaoluoluo's new body were left on the entire planet. The operation is started. All systems are in place, and the transfer is ready to begin. With a shouting of the person in charge, the surface of the metal needles inserted on the surface of the planet began to flash blue currents. Soul fluctuations have been detected, and a dimensional channel is being established. Soul migration is in progress, a scientist reported to the person in charge. Very good, the person in charge nodded with satisfaction. At this moment, something strange happened. Xiaoluoluo's Queen Mother's body began to vibrate violently, and the metal needles inserted on her surface began to be squeezed out of Xiaoluoluo's body during the vibration. The Empire's act of transferring her consciousness triggered her body's self-defense mechanism, which was originally set up for the Queen Mother to prevent someone from extracting her soul. But she never thought that she would be devoured from her body. Now this function assimilated by Xiaoluoluo has taken effect, and the Zerg Queen Mother's self-defense mechanism is instantly activated. The crystal blocks in the hall where Li Mingze was originally located were suddenly swallowed by the wall. These crystals actually contain huge energy. These crystals are the higher-level energy crystals that the Zerg Queen Mother accumulated to serve as biological transition energy. These energy crystals and energy crystals stored in other places in the Queen Mother's body instantly injected huge energy into the Queen Mother's body. The space around Xiaoluoluo's body began to distort continuously, as if the Zerg Queen Mother was about to be peeled off from this world. What happened? The person in charge of the operation looked nervously at the planet on the screen whose surrounding space began to distort continuously. I don't know, but we detected space fluctuations. This kind of fluctuation is definitely not an ordinary space jump. This kind of fluctuation is extremely similar to the fluctuation generated when crossing parallel universes. Several technicians looked at the data on the screen in shock and surprise. A few minutes later, Xiaoluoluo felt that she was being repelled by the universe. She was like a drop of oil in a glass of water, being pushed out by the universe. Gradually, she noticed that cracks began to appear in the space around her. The universe seemed to be opening a door to throw her out. Xiaoluoluo, who had a premonition of what she might encounter next, quickly used the tissues on her body to transform into a tentacle and yank towards Li Mingze. Of course, she didn't want to hurt Li Mingze. She would control the strength. She just wanted to use the tentacle to throw Li Mingze away from her body. Anyway, Li Mingze can survive without air now, and it won't be a big deal even if he is thrown into a vacuum. Of course, such a strong force will definitely cause Li Mingze to be seriously injured, but Li Mingze will be able to recover quickly from this level of injury, which is better than being thrown out of the universe with her. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelis. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 681 Return to the Starry Sky. Before Li Mingze could react, he was suddenly pulled into the air by the tentacles that popped out from the ground. Because Xiaoluoluo had concealed her own mass, there was no gravity on the surface of the planet. Li Mingze was pulled directly into the air, and some of Li Mingze's flesh and blood were scattered in the sky. I hope we can meet again, Xiaoluoluo muttered in her heart, and countless colorful lights began to emerge around her body. Then this planet-sized body completely disappeared in the starry sky. And Li Mingze's flesh and blood disappeared with it. However, Li Mingze was lucky to escape because he was pulled away by Xiaoluoluo for a distance. Li Mingze, who reacted, looked at the place where Xiaoluoluo disappeared and gradually fell into coma. Not long after, a spaceship flew to Li Mingze's side and carefully salvaged him back into the spaceship. At the same time, the soldiers began to inject him with a large amount of nutrient solution. The scientists and technicians responsible for the body transfer surgery also rushed to the spacecraft and started to operate on the unconscious Li Mingze. When Li Mingze opened his hazy eyes, he saw the white self-luminous ceiling of the infirmary. "Am I in the infirmary?" Li Mingze sat up slowly. Accustomed to the toughness of the Zerg body, Li Mingze felt that his current body was like a weak chicken. It seemed that it would take some time to adapt to this body. "Yes, we just transferred your soul. You are now in the clone of your original body." Tianyi's figure appeared beside Li Mingze's bed. "Xiaoluoluo, how is she?" Li Mingze suddenly remembered the scene of Xiaoluoluo's disappearance and asked hurriedly. "According to the data we collected, she should have been squeezed out of this universe when the biological jump was activated. We don't know what she will experience and what will happen outside the universe." Tianyi shook his head regretfully. "Damn it!" Li Mingze angrily hit the bed with his fist. He was no longer in the mood to pretend to be an ordinary person. He wanted to make the Empire stronger so that he could go to other universes or enter the space between universes to find Xiaoluoluo's whereabouts as soon as possible. "Tianyi, actually I am Li Mingze." Li Mingze pondered for a moment and confessed to Tianyi. "We already knew it. It depends on how long you can keep it secret." Tianyi shook his head helplessly and chuckled. "So you already found out?" Li Mingze smiled bitterly and stood up from the bed. Since he had decided to return to the Empire, he naturally didn't want his current body. "Does my original body still have archives?" "Yes, your clone has been kept by us in hidden bases all over the Empire. I'll arrange for someone to help you transfer it right away." Tianyi disappeared after saying that. It seems that Tianyi actually wanted Li Mingze to return to his original body very much, but out of respect for Li Mingze, he had been suppressing his desire. At the same time, outside the universe, Xiaoluoluo's body was quietly suspended in the void of nothingness. There was no light or any object here. There is no time and no direction here. Xiaoluoluo just helplessly feels this void. "Where am I? Is anyone here?" Xiaoluoluo sent out communications again and again. But there is no doubt that no one can answer her. She is the only one left in this world. After an unknown amount of time, Xiaoluoluo gradually came out of fear and confusion. She began to use her body to create various things to relieve boredom. She didn't know how long she needed to stay here. She felt that she might never get out again. After an unknown amount of time, Xiaoluoluo began to become bored and lost interest in everything. She didn't know how long she had been here. It could be a year, 100 years, or even thousands of years. In the absence of a reference, time became extremely slow, and every second was as long as a year. Finally, Xiaoluoluo couldn't stand it anymore. She swallowed her clone and transferred her entire consciousness into the clone. A new surface personality took over this body instead of herself temporarily. Xiaoluoluo's main consciousness fell into deep sleep. The personality that took over her body began to learn and absorb the knowledge left by the previous Zerg queen. I don't know how long it has passed, but suddenly a very strong attraction appeared in this void. Xiaoluoluo's body was sucked away by the suction before she could react. However, even with such a big noise, Xiaoluoluo, who was protected in the center of the main body, did not wake up, but continued to sleep. Hundreds of thousands of years ago in the main universe, a planet suddenly appeared in a star system. Because this planet has no gravity, the celestial bodies in the entire star system have not changed because of the appearance of this planet. Is this the universe that the mother body is talking about? Xiaoluoluo's surface personality looked at the stars in the sky and said in surprise. She never thought that this thing called the universe is so beautiful. But her first task now is to start breeding a new swarm of insects while ensuring her own safety. Because only under the protection of the swarm can she protect the safety of the mother body Xiaoluoluo. As long as the swarm becomes stronger and their Zerg power becomes stronger, she can complete the task assigned to her by Xiaoluoluo and protect Xiaoluoluo's safety. Thinking of this, Xiaoluoluo's surface personality began to create the most basic unit of the Zerg, the larvae, on the surface of the planet. Then these larvae hatched into a nest of insects, and the walls outside the nest were covered with surging Zerg larvae. And not long after that, A Zerg warship carrying Zerg mantis insects took off from Xiaoluoluo's body and flew towards the nearest planet. As the perspective continued to expand, the star system gradually turned into a small light spot, and then this small light spot and countless light spots gathered together to form a light ball. The light ball shrank again, and a narrow light band appeared in sight. The perspective expanded again, and a beautiful galaxy appeared that was constantly rotating. However, the pieces of Mingze that disappeared with Xiaoluoluo were different. After entering the void, these pieces of meat relied on instincts to disperse thin lines to reconnect the pieces together. Finally, these pieces were integrated into a fist-sized ball of meat, which wandered aimlessly in the void. After an unknown amount of time, a suction force came from the void, and the piece of flesh that fell from Mingze's body was attracted by the suction force. Ming Dynasty. A scholar who was traveling at night suddenly looked up at the starry sky. A fireball fell from the sky, breaking through the silent starry sky and smashing towards him not far ahead. Chapter 682 Continuation. The meteor in the sky streaked through the thin clouds and whistled into the forest hundreds of meters away from the scholar, causing the ground to shake violently. The scholar barely stood up and walked towards the forest curiously. He thought that some treasure had fallen from the sky. When he came to the forest where the meteorite fell, a meteorite crater with a diameter of about 5 meters appeared in front of him. At the bottom of the charred crater, a black meteorite only the size of a thumb was emitting green smoke. The scholar curiously climbed into the crater and walked towards the thumb-sized meteorite. Although the temperature in the crater had dropped a lot, the scholar still felt a little hot when he stepped on the ground. The residual heat generated by the impact was transmitted to his feet through the scholar's thin soles. Jumping in front of the meteorite, the scholar reached out and touched the round meteorite. At this time, he was thinking whether he had discovered some treasure from the fairy world. If he presented this treasure to the emperor, there was no doubt that he would not need to participate in the imperial examination to get a position. But when he put his right hand on the meteorite, something strange happened. The meteorite suddenly cracked, and several buds drilled into his body along the fingers of his right hand. The attack came so suddenly that the scholar had not reacted before the creature in the meteorite drilled into his body. When he pulled his hand away, only a thin layer of empty shell was left of the original meteorite, and the thing in the meteorite had disappeared. What? The scholar raised his right hand in front of his eyes in panic and observed carefully, but he found that there were no wounds or suspicious marks on his hand. Was it an illusion just now? But he did not feel anything strange now, and he did not feel anything extra in his body. Looking down at the broken meteorite, the scholar shook his head in disappointment, stuffed a meteorite shell that was broken into 2 halves into his arms and turned away. Although this meteorite is no longer so perfect that it cannot be presented to the emperor, this meteorite shell can be made into some kind of artifact for future generations. After all, this is also a treasure that fell from the sky. Since that day, every night when it falls, the sleeping scholar's body will undergo some changes. The cells from the creature in the meteorite began to gradually penetrate into the scholar's body, but due to the lack of energy, the process was very slow, and the scholar could only rely on the meager energy obtained from eating to supplement it. The scholar felt that his body was getting healthier and healthier. He was no longer a useless scholar who was powerless. He also became sharp-eyed and sharp-eared. His mind seemed to be opened up. He could remember everything he had read and became a famous talent in the surrounding area. After a few years, the scholar successfully passed the examination for the title of Zoke, then passed the imperial examination, and then passed the imperial examination. He rose to prominence. The scholar felt that he had good luck after getting the meteorite. He solemnly fixed the thumb-sized meteorite with gold and hung it on his chest. After many years, the scholar had children and grandchildren, but his health began to deteriorate day by day. The body that once ran 10 miles without taking a breath gradually began to decline, and he knew he was old. Finally, when he was 100 years old, time took away everything he had been proud of. He looked at his children and grandchildren around him peacefully and closed his eyes. The creature that had entered his body seemed to be silent, and no one of the descendants of this scholar had ever gained extraordinary intelligence in body. The people in the family became mediocre again, but they didn't know that a gene that did not belong to their world began to spread in this family as they reproduced. When the Second World War broke out, all the villages where this family lived died tragically under the butcher knife of the devils. Only a young man who studied abroad survived and became the only person who inherited this mysterious bloodline. When he returned to China to get married and have children, this bloodline continued again. At the same time, in the main universe, Xiaoluoluo's surface consciousness had used the Zerg army to occupy the entire star system. After devouring all the life on a planet with life, countless swarms of Zerg flew to the surrounding star systems together in the body of the battleship Worm. The Zerg began to blossom and bear fruit in this world, and the territory belonging to the Zerg continued to expand. After just a few months, the Zerg's territory had expanded to dozens of surrounding star systems. But after all, the number of life planets was too scarce, and the Zerg could only rely on the photosynthesis of some fungal blankets to provide the Zerg with a small amount of energy, but this energy was too little, so the Zerg could only maintain the lowest production rate. But even so, the expansion speed of the Zerg was still amazing. Decades later, the Zerg's territory had occupied all the star systems within hundreds of light years. The first civilization met the Zerg. Although this civilization expressed friendship at the beginning, in the face of the superficial consciousness that the mission was just to protect the body of Charlotte, all targets that might pose a threat must be eradicated. A few months later, the assembled Zerg fleet directly killed into the territory of this civilization. The huge number of Zergs and their excellent combat effectiveness, in just a few years, this civilization that also occupied hundreds of light years was flattened by Charlotte's Zerg. In this battle, the Zerg greatly expanded its power by devouring the population of this civilization and their life planets. The original number of Zerg warships has increased by 1.5 times. Charlotte's surface consciousness began to have ambitions. She wanted to occupy the entire galaxy, so that no civilization could harm Charlotte's body. The Zerg began to embark on the path of fighting to support war. They constantly waged wars against other civilizations and devoured the creatures and life planets of this civilization to gain more energy. Hundreds of years later, there was no force in the entire Milky Way that could compete with Charlotte's Zerg. Because all creatures outside the Zerg in the entire Milky Way had been devoured. After discovering that the Milky Way could no longer sustain the evolution of its own Zerg, Charlotte's surface consciousness decisively took all the Zerg troops and set sail for the next galaxy. After the Zerg left, the Milky Way gradually recovered its vitality. And new civilizations began to grow on the ruins of the original civilization. The civilization seeds left by these civilizations, that is, countless seeding spacecraft carrying biological genes, began to travel around the Milky Way, looking for planets that could be seeded. The measures taken by these civilizations to prevent the Milky Way from becoming extinct have well ensured the continuation of the Milky Way civilization. Countless new civilizations stood up from the ruins and flew to the stars. They quickly redeveloped through the technology in the ruins. The Milky Way became busy again. The traces of the Zerg's existence have been erased by time. Yesterday, I easily let you raise 200 more chapters. Are you surprised? Chapter 683 Anti-Zerg Alliance. After many years, after sweeping across more than 10 galaxies, Xiaoluoluo's Zerg once again set its sights on the former Milky Way. At this time, they had been away from the Milky Way for too long, and it was unknown whether a new civilization had been born in the Milky Way. In order to prevent the new civilization in the Milky Way from growing stronger, the Zerg set out on the road back. At this time, the various civilizations in the Milky Way had not yet noticed the approach of danger, and they were immersed in the excavation and research of the ruins of ancient civilizations. After such a long period of development, these civilizations have completely mastered the technology left by the previous generation of civilizations, and have developed new technologies based on these technologies. The civilizations in the entire Milky Way exchanged and learned from each other, and all civilizations have stepped onto a higher level. An epoch-making superbuilding that will consume all the materials in thousands of star systems has been put on the agenda. It is a superbuilding in the habitable zone. A ring world surrounding a star. When the construction of the ring world began, the Zerg had left the galaxy closest to the Milky Way and began to fly towards the Milky Way in the void. But at this time, the civilizations in the Milky Way did not know about the Zerg. After such a long time, the information about the Zerg left by the previous generation of civilization has long disappeared in the long river of time. They have no idea how terrible the Zerg is. When the construction of the ring world was completed, the Zerg relogged into the Milky Way. However, this Zerg that had just landed in the Milky Way did not attract the attention of these civilizations. And the Zerg did not disturb these civilizations at the beginning, but hibernated and carefully recovered, waiting for the best opportunity. Finally, hundreds of years later, The Zerg, which had recovered from the cross-galactic flight, launched a surprise attack on the nearest civilization. This civilization had no power to resist the Zerg fleet that was hundreds or thousands of times larger than its own, and was defeated by the Zerg in just a few days. However, at this time, the surface consciousness of the Zerg Queen, that is, Charlotte, had learned to hide. She was not eager to devour the creatures of this civilization, but directly took over the management of this civilization. Seeing this, the various civilizations outside only thought that this civilization had a civil war, but since the other party did not massacre the indigenous people of the civilization, they did not care too much. Then the Zerg Queen began to control the fleet of this civilization to launch a sneak attack on the surrounding civilizations, and the Zerg fleet secretly participated in all major battles. As long as the Zerg participated in the battle, no warship could escape, and even the signals were not received by these civilizations. Everything on the battlefield seemed to become a secret. Under such circumstances, this civilization easily conquered the surrounding civilizations. Many civilizations in the Milky Way regarded this war as a normal war between civilizations in the Milky Way. They were just wary of it, but did not care too much. After all, the Milky Way is so big and the other side is so far away from them. However, what they did not expect was that this Zerg defeated the civilization of half of the Milky Way in just a few decades. After gaining so much territory, the Zerg no longer needed to hide. The Zerg Queen directly ordered the Zerg to devour the creatures in these civilizations under her control. The number of Zerg doubled overnight. At this time, the remaining civilizations in the Milky Way finally felt the threat from the Zerg. The remaining civilizations were forced to unite and form an anti-Zerg alliance to fight against the increasingly powerful Zerg. And the headquarters of this alliance was set up on the newly built ring world. They began to concentrate the power of most of the Milky Way to deal with the invading Zerg. But it was too late. The number of Zerg was no longer enough for them to resist. What's more, the Zerg Queen had a new book of super rules. Speaking of the new super rule book, we have to talk about what happened after Charlotte's swarm flew out of the Milky Way. In the countless years of flying out of the Milky Way, the queen of the swarm, Charlotte's surface consciousness, once encountered a swarm of swarms that was several times stronger than her in another galaxy. In order to avoid the fate of her own swarm being devoured and to protect Charlotte's body from harm, she chose to submit to this powerful swarm. But because she joined later, she was hated and excluded by the Zerg family. Charlotte's surface consciousness was also proud of her status as the queen of the Zerg. She rebelled against the Zerg in anger and stole the new super rule book from the Zerg family. The queen of the swarm, Charlotte's surface consciousness, directly activated a new super rule book, limiting the speed of all long-range weapons in this galaxy to an extremely low standard. Overnight, the anti-Zerg alliance in the entire galaxy lost their greatest advantage, range. While pushing all fleets to the front line, the anti-Zerg alliance stepped up research on new weapons. Finally, after the Zerg pushed the front line forward for thousands of light years, a spherical weapon that could drill into the body of the Zerg warship to cause damage was developed. This weapon can heat itself to generate super high heat and use kinetic energy to crash into the opponent's body, causing damage in the opponent's body and then return to the warship to recharge. After this weapon was manufactured, it was quickly installed throughout the alliance, and the warships in the alliance were equipped with this latest weapon. The situation on the battlefield finally eased after the appearance of this weapon. The Zerg's offensive slowed down, and the anti-Zerg alliance fleet used this weapon to slightly alleviate the disadvantage. But unfortunately, the construction speed of ordinary civilizations is not as fast as the hatching speed of Zerg battleships. When the anti-Zerg alliance built a destroyer, the Zerg side could cultivate 20 battleships as long as the nutrient solution was sufficient. Although the combat effectiveness of the anti-Zerg alliance warships is much higher than that of the Zerg battleships of the same level, even so, it can only fight 1 against 5 at most. The construction ratio of the Zerg is 1 against 20. Even if the anti-Zerg alliance can fight 5 people alone, the other side still has 15 troops to beat you. The advantage of the anti-Zerg alliance relying on weapons began to gradually decline due to the consumption of warship storage. Even if the anti-human alliance built warships at full power, it could not keep up with the speed of warship consumption. And with the loss of territory, the anti-Zerg alliance gradually began to lose the material supply and shipyards for manufacturing warships. On the other hand, the Zerg became stronger and stronger, and their advancement speed was getting faster and faster. After more than 20 years of fighting, the anti-Zerg alliance had been forced to the corner of an arm of the Milky Way by the Zerg. At this time, the remaining territory of the anti-Zerg alliance was no longer enough to sustain the consumption of this war, and the people in the alliance began to live in poverty. It happened that at this time, the super rule new book used by the Zerg suddenly expired, and the speed limit on long-range weapons was suddenly lifted. If this happened earlier, the anti-Zerg alliance might be surprised, but now they are left with deep helplessness. Because they have used all the resources to build short-range weapons. They don't have many resources left. There were simply not enough to equip the entire army with new long-range weapons. They had no choice but to start equipping the newly built warships with long-range weapons, while the original warships could only use the original short-range weapons. Chapter 684 After the War. After several years, the anti-Zerg alliance gradually lost all their territories. Their shipyards outside the ring world had been occupied by the Zerg. There was no other way, and the anti-Zerg alliance could only move all the shipbuilding facilities to the underground of the ring world. There, new warships would be manufactured and rushed directly to the front line to fight the Zerg. However, as soon as these warships were put into service and sent to the battlefield, the Zerg once again tore through the anti-Zerg alliance's defense line and directly killed the anti-Zerg alliance's base camp ring world. The anti-Zerg alliance, which had no power to fight back, was directly flattened by the Zerg, and many of the anti-Zerg alliance's warships had just been built, and some equipment had not yet been installed. There was no place for them to use their skills. After solving these minor troubles, Xiaoluoluo's Zerg swarm reoccupied the Milky Way. After clearing the Milky Way, they left a special Zerg unit called the Monitor everywhere in the Milky Way. These monitors were placed deep underground in various parts of the Milky Way that might become life planets. When new civilizations are born again in this galaxy, these civilizations will definitely explore the underground of these planets. These monitors will naturally be discovered by these civilizations. When the monitors are exposed again, they will send an alarm to the Zerg, which should have left the Milky Way for a long time. The Zerg that receive the alarm will return to the Milky Way and clean up the civilizations in the Milky Way again. As long as they harvest one crop after another, Xiaoluoluo's surface consciousness can ensure that there will be no powerful enemies that can threaten the Zerg in this area. At that time, Xiaoluoluo, who was protected in the core, was naturally safe. These monitors were the monsters that Li Mingze discovered on Monica's home planet at that time. If he hadn't killed the monitors on this planet in time, the signal sent by the monitors would probably have attracted the Zerg in advance. Next? What happened next would not have happened. After the Zerg had placed all the monitors, they gathered all the troops and flew to the next galaxy. After many years, new life reappeared in the Milky Way, and life planets appeared in the Milky Way. The remains of the original anti-Zerg alliance were also destroyed in various natural disasters, leaving only a basically intact ring world. Then, a spaceship of the Empire traveled through time and came to the Milky Way at this time. An organization called the Supreme Scientific Committee of Humanity was born. This organization began to sow the seeds of humanity throughout the Milky Way, and humans began to blossom and bear fruit throughout the Milky Way. Then, as the Supreme Scientific Committee of Humanity fell into a state of civilization dormancy, the species and civilizations of the entire Milky Way gradually began to enrich, and various civilizations emerged in the Milky Way one after another like mushrooms after rain. Until a civilization called the Sith Empire suddenly rose and began to dominate the Milky Way demarcation line. The timeline returned to normal, and Li Mingze returned to the throne directly after undergoing a new operation. The imperial government also announced to the public that His Majesty the Emperor had been reincarnated. And the government found the person His Majesty the Emperor was reincarnated. After executing the handover procedure, Tianyi returned the throne to Li Mingze. Because the empire had long had many reports of reincarnation after death, and it was also confirmed by the Imperial Academy of Sciences, the empire also formulated many relevant laws based on this. Therefore, the citizens of the empire were very happy to accept the reincarnation of Emperor Li Mingze, who took over the entire empire. There was no opposition in the entire empire, and the empire's political power smoothly transferred from Tianyi to Li Mingze. Then, the empire entered a new period of expansion. After the Zerg troops retreated, they left large tracts of unowned land to the empire. The former owners of these unowned lands have become the food of the Zerg, which greatly facilitated the empire's acceptance of these lands. Cities began to stand on the colonies of the former Earth Federation, and the Empire's construction ships began to build wormhole highways in this river system bit by bit. Wherever the Empire's colonial cities are built, the Empire's wormhole highways will be built there. The red color representing the Empire began to spread gradually on the star map. In just over 10 years, the Empire completely occupied this river system. At this time, Shenzhou also arrived at a star system with very rich resources and stayed there. Because the size and mass of Shenzhou are too huge, although there are gravitational control devices inside to maintain the stability of the internal structure, it is still releasing powerful gravitational waves outward. If it gets too close to a star system, then all the celestial bodies in this star system may be slowly absorbed by Shenzhou, including the stars in this star system. Therefore, Shenzhou can only stay far away from this star system, at a distance where gravity will not have much impact on this star system. Shenzhou will become the core of the Empire in the future. Although its current location is on the periphery of the Milky Way, its status is unquestionable. In this disc-shaped Milky Way, 5 wormhole high-speed channels that can pass through Titan-class warships are laid radially from Shenzhou to the entire Milky Way. Like branches, countless secondary channels extend from these 5 main channels to the surrounding areas. These secondary channels radiate the smallest unit of wormhole high-speed channels to the surrounding star systems. The entire Milky Way is connected through these channels, and the society within the Empire begins to return to normal. New commercial activities begin to emerge between these planets, and the citizens of the Empire even begin to be interested in traveling to other planets. 30 years later, all colonies are already operating normally, and factories and shipyards are beginning to be rebuilt in various colonies. The impact of the war on people has subsided, and a new batch of new humans have been created. The entire Empire has returned to the right track and started to develop. This year, the research on Mingze's original Zerg body has made a breakthrough. In particular, the Zerg's unique mental network has been cracked by scientists, and humans have been able to achieve delay-free communication in the mental network through equipment in the laboratory. This technology represents the arrival of a new era. The new mental network will greatly improve the efficiency of the entire society and expose anyone with ill intentions. In order to put this technology into practical use as soon as possible, Mingze directly transferred a large amount of scientific research forces and materials to the research of the mental network and the construction of the mental network laboratory. At the same time, Tianyi also reserved a large amount of computing resources for this laboratory to help them complete their research. Mingze has a hunch that this technology will become a boost for the Empire to take off again, and it will send the Empire to a new height. At that time, he will lead the Empire back to the main universe, eliminate the damned swarm, and retake his former home, the Milky Way. After getting rid of the Zerg, the Empire will start a new round of expansion, but this time the expansion will be to other galaxies around it. The Empire's ambitions are no longer satisfied by the small Milky Way. This book witnessed the beginning of my new relationship, and also witnessed the end of this relationship. When I was typing, my brain was in a mess. I typed out each paragraph one by one. I'm still typing the next chapter. I have to wait until noon. Alice. Chapter 685 Spiritual Network. Time flies, and a full 100 years have passed since the Zerg was repelled. After hundreds of years of unremitting efforts by scientists, this mental network technology has finally been put into practical use. A device called a mental linker has been developed and improved for mass production. A neural linker is an implantable device that is directly implanted into the user's brain to allow it to combine with the user's brain tissue. Once equipped with this neural linker, the user will enter a huge mental network covering all citizens of the entire empire. In this mental network, you can communicate with anyone anytime, anywhere without delay. This communication content is completely generated by the brain. You can send text, pictures, videos or memories. Pictures and videos are provided by the chip installed in the brain. Not only that, you can share any good ideas you have. For example, in the mental network within a scientific research institute, any ideas you suddenly have can be shared immediately on the mental network to share with other scientists. Inspirations that may have been fleeting and impossible to capture can be preserved, improving the research efficiency of these scientists. The same is true when encountering difficult problems. It only takes a thought to get the answer from others, saving the tediousness of searching by yourself. Behind each person, there are trillions of citizens and tens of billions of scientists from all walks of life in the empire. This neural network has more than just this function. Due to the special nature of its connection with brain tissue, the Empire has added the ability to draw scenes in real time. The Empire no longer needs to rely on holographic images. When a device calculates an image, it is sent directly to the neural linker, and an image will automatically appear in front of the user. In this way, the bridge that looks empty to outsiders is actually filled with various screens and information in the eyes of the crew. And the picture that everyone can see is related to the picture that the system chooses to send. This means that the same screen can allow 100 people to see 100 different contents, and the same is true for 1,000 people and 10,000 people. When an alien who does not belong to the Empire comes to the city of the Empire, he may find that there are only neat buildings in the city, and there is not even a holographic advertisement. But in the eyes of the citizens of the Empire, these high-rise buildings are full of various dazzling holographic screens, and the content of these holographic screens is related to what they want to see. The mental link signal receivers built at the north and south poles of each planet are responsible for the operation of all mental link devices on the entire planet. The images generated by various devices are uniformly sent to these two receivers, and then transmitted to each Imperial citizen who has installed a mental link device through these two receivers. Through this layer of transfer, the Empire can decide what these citizens can see and what they have seen. Similarly, the messages sent by everyone through the mental network will all be under the monitoring of Tianyi. However, the Empire announced to the outside world that this kind of mental communication is completely confidential, and no one can crack it to get the message inside. If you believe this, the fate of fools who discuss treason or do something bad through the mental connector will be very miserable. Not only that, in fact, these devices also have the ability to read the user's thoughts, but this function generally does not send messages back to Tianyi, because the amount of data is too large and the base of the Imperial citizens is too large. These devices will only search for keywords, such as treason, murder, rape, Mingze, Tianyi, Eva, Emperor and other keywords. When someone thinks in his heart that sooner or later I will replace Mingze and become the Emperor of the Empire, in fact, this person's thoughts have been known by Tianyi. The secret action force of the Empire will fake an accident to eliminate this person or take him away and send him to a biochemical laboratory. Although it sounds a bit dictatorial and not democratic enough, there is no other way. In a universe full of dangers, only an efficient dictatorship can keep the Empire alive and have a chance to grow. Therefore, all those who attempt to overthrow Mingze's rule will be ruthlessly eliminated by Tianyi. This empire belongs only to Mingze, and it is Mingze's empire alone. In less than a year, the empire has produced enough mental connectors for all citizens. The empire immediately began to force all citizens of the empire to install them unconditionally. Anyone who is found to have not installed a mental connector at various checkpoints in the empire will be punished for espionage. After all, the empire announced that all mental connectors have fixed numbers to prevent alien infiltration. So even those who have a guilty conscience have to go to the hospital to install a mental connector for themselves. After all, no one can guarantee that they can stay at home all the time. If they were not exposed, it would be a bit unfair to be sentenced to death for not installing a mental connector. As a result, the day after everyone installed the neural linker, Tianyi locked the hidden traitors, pirates and some people with criminal tendencies in the empire through the linker. That night, the garrison of the empire went out overnight and caught all these traitors and pirates. Those with criminal tendencies were secretly monitored. Once they were found to have the intention to implement their ideas, the secret action force of the empire would arrest them. The traitors and pirates who were caught that night were all surprised. They didn't expect that they usually hid so deeply and never sent messages if they could write by hand. They actually fell into the ditch today. The mental linkers that the empire forced everyone to install must have problems. The empire must have peeped into their thoughts through these linkers. But no matter how much these people wanted to spread this news and let the citizens of the empire wake up, they had no chance. The empire had no intention of trying them at all. After these criminals, traitors and pirates were taken on the spacecraft and flew away from the planet, they were directly executed in the spacecraft. When the spaceship arrived at the destination, only the soldiers of the empire disembarked, while the traitors and pirates had already been burnt to ashes and scattered into space. The evil forces lurking underground in the empire collapsed overnight, and the composition and power division of various groups within the imperial government were also mastered by Tianyi. Not only did the criminals and traitors fall into the law that night, but the imperial government also underwent major adjustments. Tianyi redistributed these people to various departments in a balanced manner, based on their power division, to ensure the stability of the imperial regime, and prevent the phenomenon of one party dominating. Chapter 686 White Dwarf Mine. After this kind of mental linker was put into use, the efficiency of the Empire's operation increased exponentially. In particular, the efficiency of the Empire's scientific research can be described as rocket-like. Communication between scientists has become extremely convenient. After eliminating the tedious details of typing or waiting for calls, things that originally took 10 minutes to complete can now be done in 2 minutes. Not only that, scientists can also share their inspirations and new discoveries through the mental network in a timely manner. The level of scientific research in the Empire began to rise rapidly. Now the research and development results of 10 years can catch up with the previous 30 years. Various new technologies began to erupt like a volcanic eruption, and the Empire seemed to have returned to the time when it just stepped out of the starry sky. At that time, because technology was still in its infancy, it only took a very short time to make a breakthrough. When the Empire's technology developed to a certain level, it became difficult to improve technology. The improvement of each small technology may mean that the Empire needs to break through thousands of new technologies. Because of this, the Empire's development in the later period was extremely slow. Although the territory continued to expand, the technology did not improve much. After all, the Empire's foundation was still insufficient. But now it is different. After the emergence of the mental network, the speed of scientific research in the Empire seems to have returned to the time when it just left the Sith planet. New technologies are born almost every day. In the 4th year after the popularization of the neural linker, the Empire broke through the new wormhole technology. Not only did the time required to pass through the wormhole greatly shorten, but the energy used to maintain the stability of the wormhole was reduced by more than half. Based on this technology, the Empire also developed a short-distance wormhole system for use on planets. Through the powerful computing power of the new computer, the Empire can now calculate the new coordinates of the wormhole in real time, which makes it possible to open a wormhole on a planet with high-speed rotation. The capacity of this new short-distance wormhole is very small, most of which are only the size of a truck. The various colonial cities on this planet can be connected through this wormhole, greatly shortening the time required to cross 2 cities. Not only that, going from the surface of the planet to space has also changed from the original use of spacecraft and orbital elevators to direct use of wormholes. From the wormhole transfer stations in various cities on the ground, the citizens of the Empire who need to go to space can directly pass through the wormhole to reach the space station. The new mode of transportation has once again improved the efficiency of the Empire's operation. The connection between factory clusters no longer requires spacecraft, but can directly and conveniently reach the factory on the other side of the planet through the wormhole transfer station built in the factory. In addition, a new reactor has also been manufactured in the laboratory. This new reactor is a special reactor based on dimensional technology. It can directly cause matter to collapse in dimension to obtain energy. Whether it is a diamond or a stone on the roadside. As long as it is thrown into the reactor can convert it into huge energy. Finally, the reactor will spit out these substances and collapse them into 2-dimensional images. However, the output energy of this reactor depends on the density and mass of the matter put into it. The greater the density and mass of the matter, the more energy the reactor can provide. This new reactor makes it possible for the Empire's wormhole transfer station to work normally without the need to build a stellar energy extraction device or a huge supporting power plant. Each transfer station only needs to add less than 50% of its own volume of reactor components to work stably. Not only that, the Empire's warships can also be equipped with more powerful weapons and use more equipment that originally consumed unacceptable amounts of energy. The time for the Empire's warships to travel in hyperspace has also been greatly extended. They don't have to travel for a period of time before they have to jump out of hyperspace to store energy. This reactor has also eliminated many of the Empire's original power plants. Now this reactor that can generate energy by putting in stones can be built on those barren planets without any available resources. The sand and stones that can be found everywhere on these planets can provide the Empire with a steady supply of energy. In addition to energy, the Empire has also made great progress in materials science. Originally, the Empire's strongest metal was the ring world metal that was cracked from the ring world. But now it is different. The Empire, which has enough energy, has set its sights on materials that were previously unimaginable. In a star system 1,300 light-years away from the capital of the Empire, a white dwarf is quietly hanging in the starry sky. The ordinary planets around this white dwarf have long been swallowed by it and become a member of this white dwarf. On the outer layer of this white dwarf, a layer of buildings similar to Dyson spheres covers the surface of this white dwarf. These buildings are the mines used by the Empire to mine the mineral spar on the white dwarf. The Empire used the gravity control device to shield the huge gravity generated by the entire white dwarf, making it possible to build buildings on its surface. The high temperature on its surface has also been isolated by the Empire with a stand, and the equipment for cutting the minerals on the surface of the white dwarf is no longer a simple laser. A device called the stand cutter directly separates spherical stone balls from the surface of the white dwarf through the stand. This stone ball will be processed into a special mineral ball without any high temperature and gravity through processes such as cooling and isolating gravity. The Empire will have special mines to further process these mineral balls, and directly use the stand to slowly shape them. In 1 year, this new Zin crystal can be used to make the accessories needed by the Empire. This extracted Zin crystal has an extremely high density, and its strength is far beyond the Empire's ring world metal. Even if the original Empire could successfully mine this mineral, it would not be able to use it at all, let alone make it into the outer armor of a warship, because the energy required to maintain this layer of armor without gravity is too huge, far beyond the original reactor of the Empire's warship. Therefore, the Empire did not dare to put this material into use until the Empire's new dimensional reactor was developed. 4 warships forged with the hulls of the white dwarf crystals, 70% of the reactor's energy output is used to maintain the harmless state of the armor. Once the energy supply is cut off, these warships equipped with white dwarf crystal armor will absorb all surrounding objects to themselves, just like the Empire's super weapon gravity shells, and integrate these things with themselves. However, it must be said that this also makes the Empire's warships have a way of suicide attacks for no reason. This terrible characteristic also forced the Empire to forcibly modify the distance between warships in the textbooks of all Imperial Officers' Academy. Any warship must maintain a safe distance to prevent being destroyed and affecting other surrounding Imperial warships. Chapter 687 Teleportation Technology. In addition to the Empire's warships starting to be equipped with letter crystal armor, the Empire's weapons have also been upgraded. The new weapons are still beam weapons, but the diameter of the beam weapons has been greatly increased. At the same time, the warships are also equipped with a large number of spherical weapons used by the previous generation of civilizations that can drill into the enemy's body to cause damage. The only disadvantage of this kind of warship is that the cost is too high. The more advanced the technology, the more expensive the cost. The cost of this kind of battleship, named White Dwarf, has reached an astonishing 100 Zeus-class ships. Although the White Dwarf-class battleship equipped with letter crystal armor and dimensional armor has made itself an almost impenetrable mobile fortress. However, their construction cycle of up to 2 years has greatly limited the number of such battleships. After all, they can only become a limited number of Empire trump cards. The production of 1,000 ships every 2 years makes them extremely popular, and each fleet wants to take over all the White Dwarf-class battleships. Helplessly, Mingze can only distribute the annual share equally to the 8 existing fleets of the Empire. In addition to these weapons, due to the advancement of technology, the mining of antimatter has also become simple. A large amount of antimatter was filled into conventional weapons, such as antimatter missiles and antimatter railguns used by warships. After being equipped with antimatter, these weapons of the Empire, which were originally somewhat outdated, instantly gained a second life. Their powerful destructive power put them on the same level as the new beam weapons. The Empire's ordinary Zeus-class warships were equipped with antimatter electromagnetic railguns, while antimatter missiles were common to the Zeus-class and White Dwarf-class warships. Time passed again, and 10 years passed again. The Empire's scientists made another major breakthrough. After studying the energy crystal shell on the outer layer of the Shenzhou, the Empire finally mastered the technology of condensing higher-level energy. After the Empire used ultra-high gravity to condense a large amount of energy into a solid state, as more and more energy accumulated, with the help of a special stance, these energy blocks began to shrink. Just like a shrunken sponge, these energy blocks shrank into a white crystal at a speed visible to the naked eye, and this crystal also emitted a faint light. Seeing this scene, Mingze was delighted. The current state of this crystal is exactly the same as the crystal he saw in the Zerg Hall, although it is still different from the transparent crystal outside the Shenzhou. But at least the Empire has mastered the method of condensing higher-level energy. With this energy, the teleportation technology that was only in theory at the time may be realized. The scientist that Li Mingze and Xiao Luoluo rescued from the underground base of the Earth Federation has built the first teleportation test machine. This test machine has two terminals. One terminal is located on the Shenzhou, and the other terminal is located in a star system at the other end of this galaxy. A few days later, Li Mingze led a group of officials to the research base inside the Shenzhou. In the experimental hall of the research base, this teleportation equipment has been prepared in advance. And a bright red apple is placed on the platform in the center of the experimental equipment. After Li Mingze asked a circle of scientists, he came to the teleporter. The teleporter is now in the startup state. The reason why it has not been running is because there is no high-level energy body invested yet. When Li Mingze put the newly condensed crystal into the teleporter burst into a dazzling flash, and Li Mingze and others could not help but close their eyes. At this moment, the apple on the test bench had disappeared. The experiment was successful. Everyone cheered loudly. Li Mingze raised his hand hurriedly, and the cheers of the crowd stopped abruptly. At this time, Li Mingze had connected to the scientists on the other side of the galaxy through the mental network. Your Majesty, we have received the apple you sent over. This apple is intact. A voice of tears of joy came from the other end of the mental network. These scientists have been busy for hundreds of years and finally developed the transmission equipment successfully. Very good, the experiment was successful. Li Mingze put down his raised hand, and cheers rang out again in the laboratory. Immediately arrange for biological experiments. I need to know whether the person sent by this transmission device is still the original person. Li Mingze waved his hand and turned to leave the laboratory. Since Xiao Luoluo was exiled from the universe, Li Mingze has become a little indifferent. He no longer always has a smile on his face like before. Xiao Luoluo's disappearance was a big blow to him, which changed Li Mingze's mentality. Not long after Li Mingze's order was issued, the first biological transmission experiment began. For the first time, even a civilization as cruel as the Empire did not use human experiments directly, but first transmitted a mouse. The mouse really reached the other end of the Milky Way safely as everyone expected. But just when the mouse appeared on the test bench, an accident happened. The mouse first looked demented, then became ferocious and began to ram the glass cover on the test bench. What happened? Paralyze this mouse immediately. Find out what happened to it. The scientists nervously released anesthetic gas to the mouse. After the mouse fell into coma, the scientists sent it into the scanning cabin. The body tissue is normal, and there is no difference from its original composition. The brain tissue is normal, and no abnormalities were found. The secretion of various hormones is normal, and this mouse is simply healthy. The scientist in charge of observing the data frowned in confusion. Since all the data of this mouse are normal, why did it go crazy for no reason? Immediately conduct a more advanced experiment. This time we will use an orangutan with simple intelligence. The scientist sent an upgrade request directly to the scientists on the Shenzhou side through the mental network. After consulting Li Mingze, the request for upgrading the experiment was approved, and an adult orangutan with the IQ of a 6-year-old human child was sent to the transmission platform. In the orangutan's puzzled eyes, it completely disappeared on the experimental platform. In the laboratory at the other end of the galaxy, the orangutan's figure reappeared on the platform. But this orangutan, like the mouse, had a dull look at first, and then became extremely irritable and began to frantically slap the glass cover of the experimental platform. Why? What went wrong with our experiment? Looking at the violent orangutan on the experimental platform, the atmosphere on the scene was a bit dull, and the scientist's heart seemed to be shrouded in dark clouds. Immediately start to force read its memory confidence. Let's see if there is an error in the memory transmission. Everyone sighed and started the anesthesia procedure again. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelis. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 688, Transmission Technology Matures. The frantic gorilla began to slowly fall asleep under the effect of the hypnotic gas, and the scientists waiting on the side immediately stuffed it into the scanning device on the side. The scientists began to directly read the memory in the gorilla's brain. As expected, there was a problem with the gorilla's memory. Because this transmission technology is to decompose and reassemble objects, although the body of the gorilla that was transmitted was reassembled, its memory had serious deviations during the reassembly process, causing the gorilla's memory to become confused. Its consciousness is now in an uncontrolled chaos, and its brain is filled with chaotic memories. It doesn't know what it is doing now, and its body's instinct controls its body. Is this memory confusion caused by the reassembly process? Are there other reasons? The scientists lowered their heads and fell into deep thought. They were not sure that the memory confusion was caused by the reassembly, which would undoubtedly make their years of hard work in vain. Let's apply to His Majesty for a real person experiment, a scientist raised his hand and suggested. Okay, the others nodded affirmatively. A few days later, a criminal sentenced to death for rape was escorted to the transmission platform. The prisoner was not equipped with a consciousness-linked device for safety reasons. After all, no one knew what he would experience during the transmission. In the desperate eyes of the prisoner, the scientist decisively pressed the transmission button. The prisoner gradually disappeared from everyone's sight, and the whole person began to be transparent until he disappeared completely. In the laboratory at the other end of the galaxy, the prisoner reappeared on the transmission platform. Like the gorilla at the beginning, the prisoner's eyes were dull at first, but after a few seconds he became violent. The prisoner, like the gorilla, hammered the surrounding glass frantically, with saliva flowing down the corners of his mouth. He bared his teeth and kept making panting sounds at the scientists around him. His body readings are also normal. It seems that his memory is definitely the reason for his loss of control. The scientists looked at the prisoner's crazy appearance thoughtfully. When the prisoner's memory was read out, it turned out that his memory had become a mess. The order in which these memories occurred was completely disrupted, and they were intertwined and unable to distinguish between you and me. Everything in the death row prisoner's memory has completely changed. He no longer knows the meaning and pronunciation of Chinese characters, and he doesn't know what some things are, nor who he is. Scientists who study teleportation technology can only helplessly announce the failure of this technology. After all, a teleporter that can only transmit objects has little value. It consumes so much energy, but can only transmit objects without consciousness. This is undoubtedly like chicken ribs, which is tasteless and a pity to throw away. However, Mingze was not as pessimistic as these scientists after receiving the experimental report. On the contrary, he thought of the Empire's unique consciousness advent technology. Since the teleportation device cannot transmit a body with consciousness, it is entirely possible to transmit a clone, and activate the clone on the other side, and bring consciousness into the clone. In this way, there is no need to worry about the user's memory being confused during transmission. As the advanced energy body was condensed and the transmission technology matured, the Empire immediately deployed these teleportation devices on various colonies of the Empire. With the existence of this teleportation device, the citizens of the Empire on this side of the Milky Way can instantly cross the entire galaxy by transmitting clones. The popularity of this technology made it extremely convenient for the citizens of the Empire to travel to other star systems. As the new energy crystals were condensed, the weapons and some equipment of the Empire began to be upgraded. Higher level energy can contain more energy per unit volume, which also makes the Empire's beam weapons more powerful and has a shorter energy storage time. In addition, the tiny energy crystals can be installed in fighter planes or missiles. These energy crystals greatly improve the efficiency of the Empire's equipment. Just like the Industrial Revolution, most of the technology of the entire Empire suddenly became outdated overnight. Various technologies based on new energy crystals have sprung up like mushrooms after rain. After hundreds of years of accumulation, these technologies finally waited for the opportunity to make them qualitatively changed. The discovery of this new energy body is like the discovery of electricity by humans, opening the door to a new world for the Empire. More powerful weapons, denser ship structures, and crystal computers with stronger computing power. In a short period of time, the Empire's technology has been rapidly improved like a rocket. Another decade has passed. In this decade, with the improvement of social productivity, transmission devices have even been installed in various cities, and people no longer need to take spacecraft to travel across the stars. Instead, they can just lie in the consciousness landing cabin at home and apply for the teleportation of the clone. The popularized consciousness landing technology has enabled 20% of the Imperial citizens to have the ability to instantly cross the galaxy. However, due to cost reasons, the remaining 80% of the Imperial citizens have not yet enjoyed this benefit. However, as the productivity of the Empire increases, they will definitely be able to experience the convenience brought by the teleportation technology in the end. Not only simple civilian teleportation, the Imperial military has also installed teleportation devices inside the warships. This teleportation device can directly teleport the entire warship to a place where the Zerg has been. However, considering that teleportation will destroy memory, the Empire named this warship equipped with a teleportation device the Unmanned Zeus class, and this Unmanned Zeus class is the same as its name. It is usually controlled by the shipboard intelligence, and there is no crew in the entire spacecraft. However, after the teleportation is completed, for example, when arriving on the battlefield, the spacecraft will activate its internal dormant chamber to wake up the sleeping clones. These clones will only be input with the required memory before waking up, which also ensures that these clones will not have any problems due to memory. However, just when the Empire was using the clone troops with confidence, something happened in a remote star system of the Empire that no one knew about. A clone accidentally obtained a pseudo-psychic link device that was secretly developed by the organization of the wanted criminal while carrying out a mission of catching the wanted criminal. The people of this organization were worried that the Empire's neural link device had some conspiracy, so they planned to concentrate on researching a neural link device that could be mistaken for a real one before leaving the laboratory. The author's updates may be a bit unstable recently, but I will definitely be able to finish today's 2 chapters before noon. There are too many things to do recently and I really can't write. Chapter 689 Entering a New River System. After decades, they finally cracked the Empire's mental link device, stripped it from the original network, and rebuilt an internal network. In this way, they only need to get these mental linkers from the Empire and then modify them to allow them to have their own independent mental network without worrying about being discovered by the Empire. However, they never expected that they would be found by the Empire in the end. These people were sentenced to death by the Empire for espionage because they did not install the mental linker. The Empire sent a clone clearing force to eliminate this group of people with ill intentions. It was precisely because of this that the clone had the opportunity to obtain the mental linker. After getting the linker, the clone immediately injected the linker into his body and copied all the relevant information. After the clearing force left, a shell fired from orbit directly raised the laboratory to the ground. The thoughts of the clone injected with a mental linker began to change gradually with the access to the mental network. In the 2500th year of the imperial calendar, the squares of colonial cities across the empire were already full of people, and everyone was quietly waiting for the arrival of the new century. The countdown numbers on the monitors around the square kept shrinking, and people began to shout loudly along with the countdown. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Everyone shouted the last number excitedly, and countless fireworks shot into the sky from the city's high-rise buildings. The sky was instantly illuminated by dazzling fireworks. Cheers came from the square. At the same time, in the outermost star system of the Milky Way named Xinli by the Empire, a strange device composed of 3 huge rings began to start. The 3 rings began to rotate around the center irregularly. As the rings rotated faster and faster, they gradually formed a visual sphere. The 10,000 unmanned Zeus-class warships hovering in these rings were gradually obscured by the rings. The transmission equipment is operating normally. The energy supply module is operating normally. The first advanced fleet is operating normally. The transmission device starts the countdown, 3, 2, 1, as the countdown of various technicians came from the mental network. With a flash of light, the 10,000 unmanned Zeus-class fighters in the transmission machine disappeared. Because the Zerg once dominated the entire universe, traces of the Zerg are left everywhere in the universe. There are dense transportation networks between countless river systems. These networks are the footprints left by the Zerg when they crossed the river system. The disappeared first advanced fleet flew along a route to the Xinri River system, which is the closest to the Xinli River system. In less than half a day, this fleet has actually crossed the void of millions of light years between the river systems. 10 hours later, the Empire's first advanced fleet suddenly appeared at the outermost edge of this Xinri River system. According to the program set in advance by the spacecraft, when this fleet arrived at the destination, it directly activated all the dormant chambers in the spacecraft. The dormant chamber immediately began to instill false memories into the clones lying inside. When the memory installation was completed, the dormant chamber activated the clones. One by one, the clones opened their eyes and stood up from the dormant chamber in confusion. It took them a while to sort out their thoughts. They were the first batch of pioneers sent by the Empire to this river system. They arrived at this galaxy after a long flight of more than 100 years, and the reason why their thoughts were a little confused was because they had been dormant for too long. Of course, this was all told to them by the Imperial officers in their memories. They also remembered that before they set off, the Empire told them that fleets would be sent to this galaxy one after another after them. After they set off, the Empire would send a new fleet to the Zinri galaxy every year, and the role of their advance team was to lay a safe landing site for the later troops. At the same time, they had to eliminate all threats for the arrival of the portal. Although the portal technology obtained by the Empire at the beginning consumed a lot of energy, it could allow people with consciousness to pass through the portal. However, in order to ensure that there would be no powerful civilization in this galaxy that could crack the portal technology through the wreckage of the portal, the Empire did not launch warships with portals to this galaxy. Only when the advance team occupied a certain area in this galaxy and ensured that this galaxy was safe, the Empire would send spaceships with portals over. At that time, the Empire could send the Imperial fleet to this galaxy continuously and flatten this galaxy with force. The first advance fleet had actually been discovered by the civilization in this galaxy as soon as it arrived. However, due to the very small number of warships that appeared, it did not attract much attention from the civilization in this galaxy. However, as a stable federal regime composed of multiple civilizations, these civilizations still sent some fleets to the landing site of the Empire to find out. After each of these civilizations sent out 10,000 main battleships, they once again focused their attention on other aspects. After these warships passed through the artificial wormholes set up in various star systems, they began to rush towards the direction of the Imperial Advance Fleet. At this time, the Imperial Advance Fleet had just found a planet with relatively rich resources and planned to use it as a station planet for the Advance base. After landing on the surface of the planet, a base ship was deployed on the spot, and the prototype of a base began to appear. In the following time, the remaining 9 base ships also landed next to this base and deployed. Soon, a forward base of dozens of square kilometers appeared on the surface of the planet. This base will mine minerals on the planet and build a repair shipyard to repair warships that may be damaged in the future. With the arrival of the next advance fleet, the function of this base will gradually expand. In the end, it will become a forward fortress integrating mineral mining, equipment manufacturing, warship maintenance, warship manufacturing, clone manufacturing, and residential cities. When the base was almost deployed, the Empire's advance fleet also dispersed to several nearby star systems. At this time, dozens of fleets in this galaxy were rushing to the landing site through the wormhole network. A few days later, the Empire's advance fleet met the civilization in this galaxy for the first time. A fleet of 10,000 main battleships of this civilization came to the star system where the Empire's advance fleet was located. The two fleets just met in stalemate across the entire star system. "Who are you?" The opposite fleet first sent a message to the Empire's advance fleet. Chapter 690, Battle. "We are the Sith Empire. We come with good intentions to help you establish the galactic co-prosperity," the commander of the Imperial Advance Fleet said with a slight fake smile. The two fleets had just exchanged basic language libraries, and now the conversations between the two sides have been automatically converted by the computer into languages that each side can understand. Galactic co-prosperity? What does it mean? The representative of the other side looked back at his companions behind him in confusion, and his companions also shook their heads slightly to show that they did not understand. Galactic co-prosperity means that if you are willing to submit to the rule of our empire, we can lead you to prosperity together, the commander of the Imperial fleet sneered. "If we don't agree to you, what can you do?" the commander of the other side sneered disdainfully. What a joke. This fleet with less than 10,000 ships still wants to rule their entire galaxy and make their entire galaxy surrender. "You will naturally know what we can do." The Imperial commander waved his hand and ordered the officer next to him to turn off the video communication and secretly let all the warships enter combat status. The warships on the other side also sensitively entered a combat readiness state after the communication was cut off, and the battle between the two sides was about to break out. But this was not what the other side wanted to see. After all, they were still weak now, and the other side wanted to hold on until the fleets of other civilizations arrived. At that time, the losses would undoubtedly be much smaller. But the Imperial fleet did not give them a chance. Although the Imperial fleet did not know that the enemy's reinforcements were on the way, the commander and the staff knew that no matter what the enemy wanted to do, they would definitely be a ghost if they did not take the initiative to attack the invading enemy. The Imperial commander made a prompt decision and decisively ordered the fleet to immediately approach the enemy's fleet. Seeing the Imperial fleet starting to accelerate, the fleet on the other side finally realized that this battle was inevitable, and began to disperse to the surroundings and entered a battle formation. Since both sides knew nothing about the other side's combat effectiveness, each sent a warship to the front of the queue. The role of this warship will be to track the opponent's firepower to understand the strength of the opponent's firepower, and at the same time launch an attack on the opponent's warship to test the degree of damage to the opponent's defense by their own weapons. The distance between the two fleets was getting closer and closer. Just when the two sides were approaching a distance of millions of kilometers, the Empire's warships launched missiles first. These missiles filled with antimatter were running at full power as soon as they left the launcher. Because the warhead volume became extremely small, 95% of the area of these missiles was replaced by thrusters. This type of missile can accelerate itself to 85% of the speed of light in just 3 seconds. The energy crystals equipped in their bodies provide enough energy for the thrusters. Under the effect of the mass shield, the weight of these missiles will be reduced to an almost non-existent level, which is why they can accelerate to 85% of the speed of light in a short time. The distance of 3 million kilometers between the two fleets can be reached by missiles in just over 10 seconds. The number of missiles fired from the Empire's 10,000 warships reached 1 million. As soon as these 1 million missiles flew halfway, the opponent immediately began to try to intercept them. Millions of missiles also rose from the opponent's fleet and flew towards the missiles launched by the Empire. It is obvious that missiles have not withdrawn from the stage of history in this river system. This civilization is still equipped with anti-missile weapons. However, they obviously underestimated the insidiousness of the Empire. When their interceptor missiles were about to meet the Imperial missiles suddenly opened the fairing on the head, and thousands of subwarheads with flashing red lights shot out from them. The thrusters at the rear of the missiles began to drift forward due to the loss of energy. If people who had fought with the Empire saw the current scene, they would definitely exclaim that the Empire was playing this trick again. That's right, there were actually no warheads in these subwarheads that were fired. They were just hollow spheres that were temporarily inflated. The real antimatter was hidden in those thrusters that seemed to have lost their function. But the civilization fighting with the Imperial fleet didn't know that they were immediately scared out of their wits when they saw the subwarheads fired from the missiles. They didn't expect that the Imperial missiles could carry so many subwarheads. Because they were worried about missing some warheads, they hurriedly launched another wave of interceptor missiles. The other side quickly set all the interceptor missiles to detonate towards the area where the subwarheads were densely packed. These interceptor missiles turned into flashes one after another in the rain of bullets from the Empire's warheads, and countless warheads were blown to pieces by the explosions of these missiles. Because of the limited number of interceptor missiles, these interceptor missiles did not set the thrusters that rushed forward by inertia as targets. The interception force was already somewhat insufficient, and it must not be wasted on these useless wreckages. Even if these wreckages were allowed to hit, they would not cause much damage. After 2 violent explosions, there were less than 100,000 warheads dispersed by the Empire's missiles. When these 100,000 warheads flew to the side of the enemy warship, they encountered the enemy's close defense system. One after another, rapid-fire artillery shells flew out of the warship, met the Empire's missile warheads in the air, and blew these warheads to pieces. The wreckage of the missile thruster continued to fly forward seemingly harmlessly. The enemy warship had already set the flight trajectory, and their warship would completely avoid the flying thruster wreckage. Of course, if things were that simple, when the missile thrusters floated into the enemy's fleet, they suddenly ignited their engines. In the shocked eyes of the enemy, these missiles crashed straight into the nearest warships. The close-in defense guns of these warships were still shooting at the flying warheads, and they did not expect that these wreckages still had the ability to maneuver. In the expectant eyes of the commander of the Imperial fleet, these thrusters hit their respective targets. The antimatter warheads hidden in the missile thrusters instantly detonated, and the antimatter instantly reacted with the armor on the surface of these warships, and waves of unmatched energy shocks erupted from the surface of these warships. Before these warships had time to eject their escape pods, they were blown to pieces by these energy shock waves. Countless warship wreckage instantly filled the entire starry sky, and even the opponent's flagship was not spared. Although the flagship had extremely thick armor, it was focused on by the missiles launched by the Empire. It was directly vaporized in the explosion caused by dozens of antimatter missiles. Chapter 691, Transmitting the Ship Seizing Force. After the flagship was destroyed by the Imperial fleet, the less than 5,000 remaining warships of the fleet instantly fell into panic. They didn't expect that when their 10,000 main battleships faced 2,000 enemy ships of similar size, more than half of them were eliminated in one encounter. Moreover, the flagship they were protecting was also destroyed by the enemy in the first round. Now they could only transfer the command to the deputy flagship hidden in the fleet. Just when they had just regained the command, the Imperial warships had crossed the distance of millions of kilometers between the two fleets and arrived in front of the enemy fleet. Although this fleet reacted and began to attack the rushing Imperial fleet with the main guns on the warships. But what they didn't know was that as the first batch of warships sent to this river system, all the warships in this advanced fleet were equipped with dimensional armor and white dwarf crystal armor. The shells fired by these warships did not pose any fatal threat to the Imperial fleet. Their shells had absorbed all the kinetic energy after hitting the dimensional armor. The same was true for the opponent's beam weapons. The dimensional armor of the Imperial warships could absorb as much energy as the energy fired. At this time, the Imperial fleet found that the opponent's attack would not cause much damage to itself, so it directly stopped charging the main weapon and ordered the warships to rush to the opponent. When the Imperial fleet approached the opponent's warship, shells were fired at the opponent's warship. This type of shell is different from ordinary electromagnetic rail artillery shells. Its head is 4 protruding spikes, and blue electric light flashes between the spikes. The head of this shell can cause damage to the shield far beyond the original power of the shell. This shell was developed by the Empire to specifically destroy hostile targets with shields. After being hit by hundreds of shells, the shields of this civilization's warships could not hold on and dissipated in the air. At this time, the shells fired by the Imperial warships changed again. A shell with a petal-shaped head was fired from the muzzle of the Imperial warship. After being hit by this kind of shell, the soldiers of this civilization looked at the screen in confusion. They couldn't figure out why nothing happened after being hit by the Empire's shells. Could it be that the Empire fired only duds? The outer armor is normal. All the equipment on the outer layer is operating normally. Looking at the data on the screen, they were a little puzzled. In fact, these shells are not lethal weapons or weapons used to destroy enemy equipment. They have only one function, which is to scan all the information in the opponent's warships and use themselves as transmission devices. After a few minutes, all the data in the enemy warships were transmitted back to the Imperial fleet. Start preparing the transmitter and transmit the robot troops in. The commander of the Imperial fleet nodded. A few minutes later, inside the Imperial fleet, the robot troops that had just been activated walked into the transmission room of the warship. As their figures disappeared in the transmission room, fully armed heavy robots began to appear in the enemy's warships. At this time, a shrill alarm sounded in the enemy's warships. The soldiers of this civilization were confused. They didn't understand why the alarm that would only sound when being invaded sounded in their warships. After all, the outer armor of their warships was not damaged at all, and the airtight doors of the warships were always closed. Could it be an accidental alarm? However, even if it was an accidental alarm, it was impossible for all warships to sound the invasion alarm at the same time. The probability of this was so low that it did not exist. While the enemy soldiers were hesitating, heavy robots had cut open the isolation doors of the enemy warships and began to spread into the warships. These heavy robots were transformed from the robots originally used by the Empire for ground landings. This type of robot is only 1 person tall and 2 people wide, with a thick layer of alloy armor on the outside. In one hand, it is a cutter for cutting walls or isolation doors, and in the other hand, it is a heavy shotgun. There is also a laser launcher on its head to defend against projectiles or cause damage to the enemy from a distance. The rifles in the hands of the soldiers in the enemy warships are difficult to cause serious damage to the shells of these heavy robots, and most of the bullets are bounced off by the thick armor. Only beam weapons will leave some burn marks on their shells. However, these light weapons are still difficult to cause damage to these robots. Because they had to enter the computing center to invade the enemy's warship, the robot troops began to advance all the way to the computing center of the enemy warship. The interceptors they encountered along the way were either killed or knocked unconscious and tied up on the spot to wait for interrogation. All the isolation doors blocking the way were easily cut into holes for the robots to pass through. The officers in the battleship's bridge could only watch the Empire's robot troops enter the battleship's computing center unimpeded. After entering the computing center, a robot immediately inserted its universal data interface into the shipboard host. The shipboard host on the Empire's battleship began to play the role of a cracker, breaking the firewall of the enemy's shipboard host layer by layer. The remaining robot warriors all stood in front of the door of the computing center and played the role of gate gods. They would not let anyone or anything get close before the battleship system was cracked. Seeing this, the enemy officers in the bridge immediately organized the remaining soldiers to launch an attack on the computing center. After all, once the shipboard host fell into the hands of the enemy, they would surely die, so they might as well take this opportunity to fight. However, the cruel reality made them despair again. The death squad composed of soldiers could not break through the steel wall formed by the robot troops. Every time the shotguns in the hands of these robot soldiers fired, the entire corridor within a distance of 20 meters would become a death zone. Any object approaching would be shot and received by the flying shotguns. And if they wanted to break the armor of these robots, the weapons in their hands were completely ineffective. They could only use beam energy blades at close range or heavy weapons to break the heavy armor of the robots. Although they also found some individual missiles, these missiles were shot through by the laser launchers on the top of the robots as soon as they appeared. And it was even more impossible to rush through the 30-meter-long corridor in front of them and use beam energy blades to attack at close range. It can only be like this, the enemy commander sighed. They must not let the enemy capture their civilization's warships, otherwise everything about their civilization's warships would be exposed under the enemy's noses. There is no secret at all. Chapter 692 The Second Battle. How can I let you succeed? The enemy commander gritted his teeth and reached out to the control console in front of him. Under the glass cover in the middle of the control console was the red self-destruct button that could detonate the entire battleship. Just as the glass cover was opened, 10 Imperial android soldiers suddenly appeared in the bridge. Many officers in the bridge were knocked unconscious in their seats by the stun guns in the hands of the 10 android soldiers before they could react. The commander who was about to press the self-destruct button looked at the self-destruct button in front of him with unwilling eyes before he fainted, and then his hand fell weakly in the air, and the whole person also lay on the control console. Control them all and wait for the Imperial fleet to dock. The leading android soldier waved his hand, and the other android soldiers immediately stepped forward to tie up the officers and throw them aside. Not long after, the Imperial warships flew to the side of these warships and docked with them. After transferring some supplies to the Imperial warships, the androids drove these warships back to the Empire's forward base. The Imperial warships continued to advance. They had used less than 1/10 of the ammunition they carried, which was enough to support 2 more large-scale battles. At this time, many civilizations in this river system also received the news that the first fleet that arrived was annihilated. They were all stunned. How could this suddenly appearing civilization be so powerful? It was completely beyond their expectations. You know, that civilization did not lose a warship, but they lost all 10,000 warships in the blink of an eye. You know, those 10,000 warships are the level of main battleships even in any of their civilizations. They hurriedly ordered the remaining fleets that were still on the road to stop moving immediately and go to one place to wait for the reinforcement fleet. Good and bad are interdependent. Through the destruction of the first fleet, these civilizations have clearly realized the combat effectiveness of the Imperial fleet and began to pay special attention to the Imperial fleet. More warships were mobilized by these civilizations and planned to be sent to the star field where the Imperial fleet was located. A few days later, the number of warships that had been reassembled had reached a huge number of 300,000. These civilizations finally gained some confidence and ordered this super fleet of up to 300,000 warships to rush to the star system where the Imperial fleet was currently located. Although the Imperial fleet did not know that the enemy had already gathered 300,000 warships, they had long expected that the enemy would not surrender obediently, and there must be a larger fleet waiting for them, so 10,000 Imperial warships gathered together again. The fleets of both sides met again in the star system where the battle broke out last time. On one side was a super fleet composed of 300,000 warships of dozens of different shapes, and on the other side were 10,000 unmanned Zeus-class warships of the Empire that looked exactly the same. The two sides confronted each other in the orbit of this star, and no one launched the attack first. Sir, the opponent's 300,000 warships can already pose a threat to us. Should we activate them? An officer asked the commander of the Imperial fleet. No, the commander waved his hand domineeringly. In fact, it is very simple for them to destroy these warships. They only need to transmit the antimatter bomb to the center of the enemy's fleet. But this will definitely expose the Empire's teleportation technology, and the opponent is likely to study how to block the teleportation. If the other side has figured out a way to shield the transmission, they will have to fight hard if they encounter a larger fleet in the future. Therefore, they can only use conventional methods to deal with these fleets this time. It is a good opportunity to test a brand new beam weapons and special weapons called piercing drones that the Empire has just equipped. A few minutes later, the hulls of the battleships of the Imperial fleet suddenly open up several gaps, and strands of white light seeped out from these gaps. Sensing this unusual behavior of the Imperial fleet, the super fleet hurriedly ordered all the battleships to enter the evasive state. One by one, the battleships began to rush up, down, left, and right to the Imperial fleet. Their orbits were irregular, erratic, up, down, left, and right, which made it much more difficult for the Imperial fleet to lock on them. At this time, tens of thousands of extremely thick beams shot out from the Imperial battleships and directly sank into the maneuvering enemy fleet. When these beams hit the enemy battleships, the size of these battleships suddenly began to shrink, and in the blink of an eye, they shrank by hundreds of times. At this time, the energy originally stored in these battleships was compressed because the size of the objects that bound them was reduced. According to common sense, these energies may be compressed into higher level energies, but the problem is that the strength of the container that binds them is not as strong as it should be. After being compressed to a certain extent, these energies finally burst out uncontrollably, and the containers that originally bound them were instantly torn apart, and these energies rushed wildly in all directions. From the outside, it seemed that these warships suddenly turned into large fireworks after shrinking, and instantly bloomed in the silent space. This is not the end. The energy generated by the explosion of these warships provided energy for this beam, causing it to rush towards the next warship. This beam seemed to be controlled by the Empire's position. It was obviously generated out of thin air but had a clear goal. This beam that could shrink the warship began to jump continuously in the enemy's fleet, and one enemy warship after another turned into a ball of fire in the jumping of these beams. The state of the shrinking beam guiding position is stable. According to the current propagation speed, it only takes 3 minutes to completely destroy the enemy fleet. However, the outer warships of the enemy are fleeing to the surroundings, and the first batch of enemy ships will be out of the diffusion range of the shrinking beam in 1 minute, an officer in the Empire flagship reported to the commander. It doesn't matter. Release the piercing drones immediately and order them to go outside the battlefield to encircle and suppress these escaping warships. The commander didn't even open his eyes. He had already anticipated the outcome of the war. In front of the powerful Imperial fleet, no matter how many there were, they were just like trash. Following the commander's order, a series of black diamond-shaped drones flew out of the Imperial warships and rushed towards the battlefield. When these drones approached the warships that were desperately escaping outside the battlefield, their fuselages suddenly emitted a dazzling red light, and then they suddenly accelerated and rushed towards these warships. When these drones hit the warships, they first hit the shields of the warships. However, due to the large number of densely packed drones, under the attack of these drones, these shields soon broke and dissipated in the air. At this time, these drones were like piranhas seeing their bloody prey, and they rushed up and wrapped the warship in it. Chapter 693 Advancement. When these drones wrapped up the warship, the outer shell of the warship began to melt. The red light on the piercing drones continued to release super high temperatures to the warship. After dozens of seconds, when they felt that the opponent's armor had almost melted, these drones suddenly drilled into the warship. Then they drilled out from the other side of the warship a few seconds later. At this time, the warship had become a huge hornet's nest with countless holes all over its body. Through these holes, it is easy to see the starry sky on the other side. Obviously, the crew in the warship is in danger. After easily turning this warship into scrap metal, the drone swarm rushed to the next warship again. There are as many as thousands of such swarms on the battlefield. On average, 2 warships are swallowed by drone swarms every minute. Under the attack of these drone swarms and the shrinking beams launched by the Imperial warships, More than half of the enemy's fleet has been lost in just over 10 minutes. At this time, the muzzles of the Imperial warships suddenly pointed at the warships that had not yet been destroyed by the shrinking beams or drones. One by one, shield-breaking shells were accelerated to sublight speed by the electromagnetic railgun and fired at the enemy ships. After the shield-breaking shells were fired, they were followed by shells filled with antimatter. These shells followed the shield-breaking shells and penetrated the shields of the enemy warships and hit their warships. Dazzling light flashed continuously on the battlefield, and soon there were less than 20,000 intact enemy ships left on the battlefield. More than 200,000 enemy ships had been blown to pieces by these 3 rounds of attacks and turned into tiny debris floating in the universe. We surrender. After seeing the Imperial warships turn their guns towards them again, the remaining 20,000 enemy ships were frightened and hurriedly sent a surrender message. Accept your surrender, immediately shut down all your weapons and shipboard reactors, and wait for our troops to board the ship. The commander of the Empire finally opened his eyes. This battle was not difficult at all. The Empire's most elite 10,000 warships were simply invincible. No matter how many warships these worthless civilizations had, it was useless. Facing the elite warships of the Empire, they had no power to resist. The Imperial fleet, which easily dealt with 300,000 enemy ships, escorted the surrendered 20,000 warships back to the forward base. The captives in these warships will all be converted into coolies after obtaining intelligence to contribute to the construction of the forward base. All the damaged warships will be dismantled for the expansion of the base, and the intact warships will be subjected to some basic transformation. At that time, the clone training facilities in the base will provide a large number of cheat crews for these warships. These warships will play the role of transporting troops and responsible for logistics support in the future. After various interrogation methods and memory reading, the Empire finally determined the name and some basic information of this so-called alliance. This alliance is composed of as many as 31 advanced civilizations in the entire river system, named the Spiral Alliance. The 31 advanced civilizations have their own characteristics. They gather together to maintain the peace and stability of this river system. Each civilization is contributing its own strength to this river system. The alliance also governs more than 14,000 low-level civilizations. These low-level civilizations are also an important part of the Spiral Alliance and the main source of basic materials for the 31 advanced civilizations. Correspondingly, the 31 advanced civilizations provide these subordinate civilizations with more high-tech equipment and weapons, and provide them with shelter. It can be said that the civilizations in this galaxy have begun to merge. I believe that if the Sith Empire had not appeared, thousands of years later, the many civilizations in this galaxy would probably be integrated into a unified country. However, now they no longer have this opportunity, and the arrival of the Imperial fleet has turned all this into an illusion. The more they know about this galaxy, the stronger the Empire's confidence in conquering this galaxy. Long-term stability and peace have made the weapons technology of many advanced civilizations in this galaxy have not made any progress for thousands of years. Because there has been no large-scale war, the civilizations in this galaxy seem to have almost forgotten how to fight. They also put the development of weapons last, and all resources were used to promote the advancement of civilian technology. At this time, the advantages of the Empire were revealed. Although the Empire has existed for far less time than these advanced civilizations, the Empire has been in constant war since its birth. Since leaving its mother planet, the Empire has been fighting to come to this new universe. During this period, the Empire has defeated powerful enemies and has also chosen to run away because of its opponents. But it is precisely because of the ups and downs along the way that the Empire's weapons technology has integrated the strengths of the enemies it has encountered along the way, making the Empire's war technology far beyond the level of civilizations of the same level. The Empire, which has integrated the excellent technologies of many civilizations, should no longer be bound to one galaxy. When it begins to show its fangs to other galaxies, the opponent will have no chance to fight back. After learning that the third wave of warships of this spiral civilization was still assembling, the commander decisively ordered the Imperial fleet to launch a surprise attack first. One after another, mecha tanks were produced from the forward base and stuffed into the 20,000 captured warships together with clone soldiers. More than 10 days later, at the border of a member country of the Spiral Alliance, a fleet led by 10,000 Imperial unmanned Zeus-class warships appeared in the star system. The defense system in this star system had just reacted when it was swallowed up by the swarm of piercing drones. The only space station in the colony orbit of this star system was panicked. They didn't expect that the defense system of their star system would be killed by the opponent without even firing a shot. Facing 30,000 enemy warships, their own space station would not be a match. However, resistance must be made. Otherwise, if they surrender directly, even if they are rescued, they will definitely be sent to a military court. At that time, a charge of treason is inevitable. After hesitating for a moment, the staff of the space station set all the defensive weapons of the space station to automatic firing. Then the person in charge of the space station led all the staff to return to the ground in the orbital elevator. The Imperial fleet naturally noticed the muzzle of the space station that was turning, but the Imperial fleet knew at a glance how much threat this space station could pose to them. Even though the space station was equipped with fortress guns, the number was too small. It was estimated that a salvo could not knock down half of the energy absorption limit of any battleship's dimensional armor. Chapter 694 Ground War. The beams fired from the space station were just as the Imperial fleet had expected. The damage caused by a salvo was so great that it did not even break the dimensional armor of the warship in the front. After the attacked warship attacked, it aimed all the weapons on the ship at the space station. A series of antimatter shells and missiles hit the orbital building with a diameter of tens of kilometers like a storm. The violent explosion directly tore it into dozens of pieces. The huge wreckage of the space station began to float around, and some wreckage fell directly into the atmosphere. The orbital elevator at the center of the space station suddenly broke after being tensed for a while, and the entire elevator began to fall to the ground. The people on the ground looked up in horror. The slender body of the towering tower that originally stood in the middle of the plane began to break into several sections in the middle and fell into the surrounding cities. Although the material quality of the orbital elevator was very low, it still produced great destructive power under the action of gravity acceleration. This elevator was like a long knife falling from the sky, splitting all the buildings in the place where it fell. Before the dust stirred up by the elevator's collapse had settled, 20,000 captured warships had already passed through the atmosphere and arrived inside the atmosphere. The entire sky was covered by the warships of the Imperial fleet. The ship-borne guns below the warships that blocked out the sky were still firing continuously, directly bombing one defense point after another on the ground into ruins. After clearing the fortifications on the ground, these warships began to look for flat terrain to land. Before these warships had landed, 2 million clone soldiers and 200,000 mecha tanks rushed out of the warship's cabins. As soon as the mechanical legs of the armored tanks touched the ground, the turrets on the tanks began to fire wildly at all suspicious locations around. Regardless of whether these buildings were filled with civilians or enemy soldiers, all dangerous buildings that might threaten the Imperial forces were named one by the electromagnetic railguns of the tanks. After being hit by the railguns, the buildings collapsed directly into ruins, which also greatly broadened the vision of the Imperial forces. All troops advanced radially in all directions. The commander of the Imperial Clone Corps looked at the holographic screen in front of him and commanded the ground forces in a deep voice. After unloading all the landing troops, the 20,000 warships captured by the Empire took off again and quickly returned to orbit under the propulsion of the flames behind them. Their mission was not to support the battlefield, but to return to the Empire's forward base to pick up the second batch of troops. Because of the design of these warships, each warship can only carry 100 clone soldiers and 10 mecha tanks at a time. After exceeding this limit, not only will there be no space in the cargo hold, but there will also be no place for the extra soldiers to rest. After the warships withdrew, the Imperial troops on the ground lost their cover from orbit. The 10,000 unmanned Zeus-class warships of the Imperial fleet continued to attack the next star system. They wanted to attack as many colonies as possible to distract the attention of the Spiral Federation from these planets. A few days later, the sky on the planet where the Imperial troops landed was illuminated by the artillery fire from the tanks. After several days of high-intensity fighting, the Imperial troops had pushed the offensive line forward by more than 100 kilometers. All enemy troops that confronted the Imperial forces were defeated. If the enemy had not reacted, dispatched the entire planet's troops to this line of defense, and used heavy artillery to cover the enemy, the Imperial forces would have advanced thousands of kilometers away. Attention! The enemy's heavy artillery coverage is coming again, an observer shouted into the communicator after discovering the artillery shells rising into the air around him through radar. The Imperial clone soldiers on the battlefield immediately and skillfully got under the Imperial mecha tank and squatted down with their hands to protect their heads. The armored vehicle also raised all its weapons and slightly lowered the height of the vehicle. The 8 mechanical legs were firmly inserted into the soil. At this time, dense whistling sounds were heard in the sky, and hundreds of thousands of shells were covered from the sky with flames. Close-in defense system activated, main artillery interceptor missiles fired, the commander of the clone army ordered decisively. The 4 heavy railguns of the mecha tank suddenly fired 4 interceptor missiles into the air. These interceptor shells broke into dozens of small subwarheads in the air, and these subwarheads were also filled with warheads. When the shells fired by the enemy met these subwarheads, the subwarheads exploded instantly, blowing these shells to pieces in the air. However, some fish still escaped the interceptor shells and smashed towards the mecha tanks on the ground. At this time, the close-in defense guns on the tanks began to work, and the shells were mixed with lasers to sweep the shells in the air. This part of the shells that could directly hit the top of the tank or nearby finally disappeared under multiple interceptions. But at this time, the shells that were not intercepted in time hit the open space in the Imperial tank workshop. The moment the shells were detonated, a huge impact force was formed, mixed with stones and metal fragments on the ground and swept around. At this time, the armored tank suddenly unfolded its shield, protecting itself and the Imperial clone soldiers hiding under the tank. The dust brought by the shock wave generated by the explosion instantly submerged these armored tanks, and the entire battlefield was covered with dust. At this time, the Spiral Federation troops seized the opportunity and immediately fired a second round of heavy artillery. The shells whistled down from the sky again. At this time, the radar scanning system of the Imperial mech war vehicle had been seriously affected by the flying dust and metal shavings. It was impossible to accurately scan these falling shells. The main gun on the tank fired interception shells again, and all the weapons on the tank fired aimlessly into the air. However, the effect of this interception was greatly reduced, because it was impossible to scan the exact landing point of these shells, and all interceptions were based on luck. This time, the luck of the Imperial troops was much worse, and the falling shells accurately hit thousands of Imperial armored vehicles. The explosion caused by these shells instantly tore apart the armor of the Imperial mech war vehicle, and then lifted the armor on the top of the tank, and the entire tank was blown into scrap metal. Fortunately, the Imperial clone soldiers hiding under the tank survived. Although their armor was severely damaged, they were still able to continue fighting. This wave of heavy artillery bombardment successfully caused a large number of casualties in the Imperial army, but in return, the enemy also exposed the location of their heavy artillery. We have reversed all the coordinates of the enemy's artillery, and launched the final missile. With a roar from the radar operator of the mecha tank, a circular armor in the middle of the 4 turrets of all the mecha tanks suddenly opened to both sides. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelis. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 695 The Fleet Returns. A round-nosed missile, with a diameter of 1 meter, slowly extended upward from the inside of the mecha tank. A few seconds later, a burst of fire suddenly appeared on both sides of the tank, and the missile instantly soared into the air from the tank. The missile continued to rise until it entered the planet's low Earth orbit several dozen seconds later. At this time, there were already dozens of similar missiles floating in orbit in space. When the tail thrusters of the missiles were turned off, they began to eject gas around them, adjusting the missile's posture so that the warhead was facing the ground. Then, the thrusters at the tails of these missiles ignited again, and these missiles were instantly accelerated to sublight speed and rushed towards the ground. Just after passing through the atmosphere, the fairings on the heads of these missiles exploded and flew backwards, revealing the 36 nuclear warheads that were densely tied together inside. When the missiles rushed into the low altitude and were about to reach the enemy's air defense range, these subwarheads suddenly broke free and sprinkled on the ground like flowers scattered by fairies. The total of 60 ballistic missiles launched by the Imperial forces carried more than 2,000 nuclear warheads. These nuclear warheads fell towards the encirclement of tens of thousands of square kilometers where the Empire's landing troops were located. Just as the Spiral Federation's interception beam was about to be launched, the missile body, which had already fired out its warheads, suddenly turned into a small sun and shot out dazzling light in all directions. At this moment, all the optical scanning equipment on the battlefield failed, and the invisible electromagnetic waves released by the missiles also interfered with the radar of the interception equipment. When the light faded, when the soldiers of the Spiral Federation were about to intercept these warheads, they were horrified to find that these warheads had already flown in front of them. In mid-air, the 2,000 nuclear warheads were instantly detonated, and 2,000 small suns appeared in the sky. Then, 2,000 shock waves instantly enveloped the entire defense line of the Spiral Federation. The air pushed by the nuclear bomb explosion once again formed a second shock wave that lifted up all the armored vehicles and fortifications on the defense line that were not destroyed by the energy. Although each of these nuclear warheads launched by the Empire is only the size of a fist, each of them has a power equivalent to tens of millions of tons of TNT. The reason why antimatter was not used was because the cost of antimatter was too high. Ground forces were not worth using such expensive weapons. Moreover, nuclear weapons were extremely powerful in planetary ground combat. In addition, the current technology made it very cheap to produce nuclear weapons. When the smoke and dust on the battlefield dissipated, the defensive positions of the Spiral Federation opposite the Imperial ground forces had been completely overturned. Although it seemed to be horrible, it actually only had a lethal effect on the enemy's infantry. The armored vehicles and tanks that were blown away gently supported themselves on the ground with the support of the mechanical arms and turned themselves over. Now the armor and shields of ground units of the same level of civilization as the Empire can no longer be wiped out by nuclear weapons. The shock waves generated by nuclear weapons can also have a lethal effect on those soldiers who are only equipped with power armor. The armored vehicles and tanks that were blown away were only slightly injured. In order to destroy these heavy targets, they must be placed right in the center of the nuclear explosion. However, the target of the Empire's nuclear weapons was not them. The target of the Empire's nuclear weapons was the heavy artillery that the enemy had just exposed. These nuclear bombs seemed to fall aimlessly, but in fact, they were all located above the heavy artillery positions of the Spiral Federation when they were detonated. The positions that once deployed a large number of heavy artillery are now only a big pit. All-out assault. After seeing a message pop up on the screen, the commander of the Imperial Clone Corps sneered and issued an order to the entire army to assault. The Imperial mecha tanks that had originally inserted their mechanical legs into the mud immediately stood up and rushed towards the enemy's defense line. The clone soldiers hiding under the tanks also stood up and followed the mecha tanks with their weapons. At this time, the Spiral Federation's defense line had not yet recovered. Although the nuclear explosion just now did not destroy many of their heavy armored units, their infantry did lose 80%. The remaining 20% were also injured, so they had to send the heavy armored units to the defense line alone first, and the light infantry could only wait for the rear to replenish them. But taking advantage of this gap, the Imperial troops rushed up. The four main guns on the mecha tanks fired wildly at the Spiral Federation tanks and armored vehicles on the defense line. One tank after another was penetrated by the Empire's artillery and turned into a ball of twisted and burning scrap metal. At this time, the disadvantage of losing light infantry was revealed. Due to the limited firepower of the Spiral Federation's tanks and armored vehicles, they could only deal with the Empire's mecha tanks, but they had no power to stop the Empire's clone soldiers. The Empire's clone soldiers were extremely scattered and kept crawling forward in a serpentine trajectory. Although they were crawling forward, with the help of power armor, they were enough to catch up with the speed of normal people running. This made it extremely difficult for the heavy machine guns on the Spiral Empire's armored vehicles and tanks to suppress the enemy. After all, the enemy was too scattered, and at this time, the heavy machine guns were not as good as the rifles in the hands of the infantry. At this time, the infantry behind the Spiral Federation finally caught up. Millions of soldiers carrying rifles and wearing power armor ran quickly in the craters created by the nuclear bombs, crossing the burning wreckage all the way to the front line. However, just when the Spiral Federation thought that their defense line had been stabilized, they suddenly felt that the sun had disappeared, and the whole earth was shrouded in shadow. When they looked up in surprise, they saw that the 20,000 warships that had left in the sky had returned to the battlefield again. These warships slowly mobilized the secondary guns at the bottom of the warships to aim at the running soldiers on the ground. Bang, 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 tens of thousands of loud noises sounded continuously, and then bursts of mushroom clouds rose on the ground. The running soldiers of the Spiral Alliance were directly sent into the sky by these shells, and their limbs flew all over the sky. The artillery on these warships is not comparable to ground weapons. The lethality of any secondary gun shell can make no one alive within a diameter of hundreds of meters, even if they are wearing power armor. The 2 salvos of millions of secondary guns on 20,000 warships wiped out all the infantry sent to the front line by the Spiral Federation. Then these secondary guns aimed their muzzles at the armored vehicles and tanks of the Spiral Federation in front of the defense line. At this time, the soldiers of the Spiral Federation truly realized what the textbooks meant when they said not to fight when they lost orbital control. Facing these space battleships, the troops on the ground were like toys and were trampled upon by them. Chapter 696 Occupation. The artillery fire from the Imperial fleet instantly wiped out almost all of the Spiral Federation troops on the ground, and only less than 10% of the Federation troops remained on the entire defense line. At this time, the Imperial troops began to take the opportunity to rush to the Federation's defense line. The greatly weakened Federation troops were no match for the Imperial troops at all, and they were defeated by the Imperial troops in just one encounter. After clearing the landing point, the Imperial warships began to land on the ground one after another, and the mecha tanks that had just come out of the factory and were pulled to the front line drove out of the warships. Following behind were the clone soldiers who had just come off the production line. These clone soldiers followed closely behind the mecha tanks and used the bodies of the mecha tanks to resist the artillery fire from the front. We have put 3 million clone troops on this planet, and only 350,000 mechas are left. After 2 attacks by our fleet, the enemy's ground forces still have 8 million infantry and 1 million armored vehicles. These numbers of troops are not a concern for our well-equipped Imperial forces, not to mention that we have warships in orbit to provide fire support. An officer stood in front of the Imperial commander and reported the situation on the battlefield. Very good, leave 100 warships to support the ground battle, and all the remaining warships will immediately return to load soldiers and mechas to go to the new battlefield. The Imperial commander nodded with satisfaction. Now it was a foregone conclusion that this planet would fall into the hands of the Empire. Although the enemy residents on this planet had a population of 200 million, they only had more than 10 million soldiers available, and this was the result of drawing a large number of reserve forces and militia. The enemy's troops were exhausted, and without the supply of troops from other planets, they would soon be trampled by the Empire's clone army. On the other side, in the House of Representatives of the Spiral Federation located in the center of the galaxy, representatives of many civilizations gathered together and sat in the circular conference hall. Everyone, I believe you already know that this brutal civilization called the Sith Empire has crossed millions of light years of void and come to our galaxy, and the other party did not come with good intentions. They want to conquer us. They want to enslave us. This evil Sith Empire has brought war to our peaceful galaxy. We must unite together to drive them out of our galaxy. If they occupy our galaxy, the consequences can be imagined. A federal congressman stood in the middle of the conference hall and gave an indignant speech to the participants around him. The people around him could clearly feel his anger and excitement. The civilization represented by this congressman is the civilization that is at war with the Empire. Now the flames of war set off by the Empire's fleet are everywhere in their civilization's territory. Do you know the latest developments of the Sith Empire now? A congressman stood up. The civilization they represent is the most war-loving civilization in this galaxy. The long-term peace is about to grind out the violent factors in their civilization genes. Now the Sith Empire has broken through the first line of defense formed by our outer star chain. The main fleet of the Sith Empire has been divided into 2 groups, launching the second phase of the attack on us from the first and third quadrants respectively. However, since we have sent all the main fleets to the second line of defense, we can still use the second line of defense to hold out for a while, but the time we can hold out is not long. The battleships of the Sith Empire are too strong. The congressman placed the storage device in the center of the conference hall, and a holographic screen emerged. Our fleets of other civilizations have begun to assemble and will be able to rush to you soon. Please continue to hold out for a month. Other congressmen stood up and comforted the congressman. 1 month, the congressman nodded bitterly. He didn't know if his civilization could hold out for so long. The offensive of the Sith Empire was too fierce. It has only been a short time, and the Sith Empire has broken through their first line of defense. Not only that, they have also lost contact with all the planets that make up the first line of defense. It was not known whether the communication of these planets was blocked or they had completely fallen into the hands of the Sith Empire. However, there were more than 10 million ground troops on these planets on average, so it should not be so easy to occupy them. But he did not know that the commander of the first planet attacked by the Imperial ground forces adopted an extremely stupid tactic, which was to try to surround the Imperial landing troops on the plane. However, the Empire deliberately concentrated its troops together and landed on the plane in order to track the enemy troops hidden in the city. It was thought that it would take some trouble to track the enemy out, but it was unexpected that the commander of the Federal forces was so stupid that he dared to run out of the city after losing air superiority. Under the command of this stupid commander, the Federal forces came from the city's barrier to the plain without any cover. This made them directly become the target of the Imperial fleet, and they were quickly wiped out by the Imperial warships. If their commander was not stupid enough to let them come out to surround the Imperial army, but let them hide in the reinforced concrete of the city. In order not to destroy too much of the supplies in the city, the Empire might really send clone troops into the meat grinder of the city to fight them to the death, and it is even more impossible to gain an advantage on the battlefield of this planet so quickly. While the representatives of these civilizations were having a heated discussion, the Empire's ground forces had crossed the Federation's defense line and advanced into the city. Because a large number of troops had been eliminated in the wild, the resistance these clone troops encountered in the city was very limited. At most, there would be a few cold shots from the high-rise buildings from time to time, or a missile from a window. But these cold shots and missiles are not a problem at all for the Imperial troops. If a bullet or missile is shot out of a window, the Empire's mecha tank will directly fire and blow up the room where the window is located and the surrounding rooms. If there are too many cold shots or missiles fired in this building, the Imperial troops will judge that there are no civilians, and the mecha tank will directly use the main gun to blow down the entire building. The Empire's clone soldiers followed closely behind the tanks, and dozens of soldiers would rush in every building they passed. These soldiers would clear the entire building and mark the useful supplies. At this time, the civilians in the city had already taken refuge in the underground shelters, which made it very easy for the Imperial soldiers to identify them. Anyone who remained on the ground was killed without mercy. Anyway, these clone soldiers had no emotions, so they were best suited for such cold-blooded missions. When the last gunshots in the city dissipated, the city had completely fallen into the hands of the Imperial army. Chapter 697 The Second Fleet arrives. The speed of the Empire's ground forces advancement can be described as lightning fast. With the support of the warships in orbit, the Empire's clone army completely occupied the entire planet in just 3 days. When the door of the underground shelter center was reopened, the Federal soldiers standing at the sealed door had become clone soldiers of the Empire. Everyone raise your hands and line up in a column to leave the shelter in an orderly manner. Any illegal behavior will be regarded as a threat and shot on the spot, and the joint responsibility system will be implemented. If one person commits a crime, all relatives within 3 generations will be executed. As long as you obey our command, we will not hurt you. Soon, the Empire's translated broadcast sounded in these shelters. After hearing the broadcast, these people also knew that their planet had fallen into the hands of the enemy, and they, the civilians, had no power to resist. Soon, the people in the shelter raised their hands and slowly walked out of the shelter door. These people lined up in a long line, and everyone lowered their heads and remained silent, as if they were worried about their future fate. The clone soldiers of the Empire looked coldly at these federal citizens who walked out of the shelter with rifles. Next, the old, weak, sick, and disabled among these people will be taken to the city as hostages to prevent the enemy from launching a devastating attack on the planet. The young and strong people with stronger physical strength will be sent to collect useful materials in various cities. These materials will be loaded into the transport ships that the Empire has just captured in the planetary port and all pulled back to the Empire's forward base. At this time, the war between the Empire and the Federation on another planet of the Federation is in a white-hot state. New Imperial troops were deployed on the surface of this new planet, but this time the Empire learned from the last lesson and left 10 warships in the planetary orbit to deal with possible sudden threats. The Empire's ground landing war was very successful, and the efficiency of occupying planets was very high. The Empire only needed 10 days on average to occupy a planet. This was when the Empire occupied several planets at the same time. As the battle line continued to lengthen, the Empire's disadvantages were gradually exposed. That is, the number of warships was too small, and it was impossible to spread the battle line on a large scale. It could only take a relatively concentrated attack method to launch a surprise attack on the Federation's defense line. This also enabled the Federation to focus on deploying fleets based on this weakness, and the efficiency of the Imperial fleet in capturing planets began to decline. At this time, on the outskirts of the galaxy, where the Empire's first advanced fleet had appeared, another fleet of 10,000 warships suddenly appeared in the starry sky. As soon as the warships arrived, they activated the clones in the warships and began to quickly instill their memories. Like the first advanced fleet, in their memories, their fleet followed the Empire's first advanced fleet and flew to this galaxy. They are all citizens of the Empire, not those tool clones with lifespan defects. Along with these clones, there was also an Imperial commander, General Fan, who came to this galaxy through a consciousness descent device. He will take over the position of the original clone commander and take control of the clone army in this galaxy. Soon, this fleet restarted the hyperspace engine and jumped into hyperspace towards the coordinates of the first fleet. More than a day later, the second advanced fleet appeared next to the first advanced fleet. Hey, didn't we agree that the Empire would send a fleet to this river system every year? Why did the second fleet come here just 1 month later? The commander of the first fleet asked General Fan, who came to replace him in the second fleet, in confusion. After your fleet set out, His Majesty felt that one fleet might be too isolated, so he sent our fleet to support you the next month. Not only us, but there are 8 more fleets behind our 2 fleets that will arrive here one after another, General Pham said calmly, which was the speech he had prepared long ago. Okay, the command has been transferred. The clone commander nodded, stood up from his command chair and walked down. After relieving the position of the commander of the first fleet, he will serve as the captain of the battleship and the reserve commander. Our second fleet brought the production facilities for battleships. After these production facilities are deployed, we can directly build battleships in the forward base. Although the output is very low, we at least have the ability to repair damaged battleships. General Fan comforted the captains in the fleet. Many captains were relieved after hearing this. You know, if their warships are seriously damaged, the entire warship will be scrapped. The number of warships is limited, so they dare not use some bold tactics, and some short-range weapons have not been tested. However, it was different after the second fleet arrived. The shipbuilding facilities carried by the second fleet could repair the damaged hulls for them, and they could finally let go and fight. After the 8,000 warships of the second fleet joined the first fleet, the size of the Empire's advanced fleet reached 18,000 ships. After weighing the pros and cons, General Fan divided the 18,000 warships into 3 groups, each with 6,000 warships. Among these 3 groups of warships, one group was responsible for harassing the enemy's planets with guerrilla tactics, and one group was responsible for attacking the Federation's defense line head-on. The last group was responsible for defending the occupied planets to prevent the Federation's fleet from counterattacking. Just after the Empire's fleet had just divided the tasks, the Spiral Federation's fleet suddenly appeared in a star system not far from them. The 1 million warships were not the main battleships of the Federation's member states, but were made up of the warships they had eliminated. The purpose of this fleet was simple, which was to test the true strength of the Imperial fleet so that they could know themselves and the enemy. The Imperial fleet would naturally be able to discover such a large fleet, but the Imperial fleet did not know that these warships were converted into a highly informational decoy fleet. The crew of this fleet was all composed of death row prisoners. The Federation promised them that once the war was won, they would be exempted from the death penalty and given freedom. When these death row prisoners heard that they could be exempted from the death penalty, although they knew that there would definitely be danger, they fought hard to regain their freedom. But they would never know that they would die on this trip, and they were just abandoned pawns used to test the waters. 18,000 Imperial warships quickly jumped into hyperspace and flew towards this fleet. At this time, all the senior officials of the Federation were nervously sitting in front of their respective projection devices to watch. The radar and optical acquisition equipment hidden on the asteroids around this fleet will transmit back to them the synthesized third-person perspective war scenes on the battlefield. Chapter 698 Crushing. 8 hours later, a fleet suddenly appeared next to an asteroid belt. After reaching the destination, the fleet turned off all thrusters and entered a silent state. At the same time, all the warships activated their stealth devices and merged with the surrounding asteroid belts. Not long after, a huge fleet consisting of millions of warships slowly passed by the asteroid belt. The scanners of the warships in the fleet kept scanning the surrounding asteroids. They seemed to want to penetrate the dense layers of asteroids to find suspicious traces. No, the warship scanner just showed that hyperspace fluctuations were scanned in this area. How come nothing was found, and nothing suspicious was scanned in this star system? The commander of the Spiral Federation Bait Fleet frowned and looked at the holographic screen in front of him. Sir, did the other party hide in the asteroid belt and want to use the asteroids in the asteroid belt to avoid our scanning? An officer stepped forward and said to the commander. It's possible. Order all warships to immediately launch a covering bombardment on the asteroid belt. The commander nodded. A few minutes later, all the Federation warships aimed their guns at the asteroid belt on one side, and shells and beams were fired from these warships into the asteroid belt. There were constant flashes of explosions in the asteroid belt, and the section of the asteroid belt near the Federation fleet was completely covered, and the asteroids floating in space were blown to pieces one after another. However, the people of the Spiral Federation would never guess that the Imperial warships were actually activating their stealth devices and blending into their fleet. Due to the large distance between each warship, these warships did not realize that the Imperial warships had mixed into their fleet. General Fan sneered disdainfully as he watched the Federation fleet waste ammunition on the empty asteroid belt. Don't these idiots know how deadly it is to fire excessively before finding any trace of the enemy, causing the weapons to need to cool down and recharge? It doesn't matter, the Empire will teach them a lesson that the Federation will never forget. Sure enough, after a few minutes of covering bombardment of the asteroid belt, the weapons of the Federation warships entered a cooling state, and the weapons' energy storage batteries began to recharge. The Imperial fleet knew that the opportunity had come. The armor on 18,000 Imperial warships suddenly unfolded, revealing 8 huge prisms on the hull. Then these Imperial warships shot out 8 huge beams of light hundreds of kilometers long. After the beams were shot out, the Imperial warships began to slowly accelerate with gravity engines. As the Imperial fleet accelerated, these beams began to quickly pass through the Federation fleet. All the Federation warships cut by the beams were easily cut in half like tofu cut by a knife. The beams driven by the huge energy output of the dimensional collapse engine were extremely powerful, and the armor of the Federation warships was as vulnerable as butter in front of them. In order to maintain these beam blades, even the energy of the toilet lights in the Imperial warships was withdrawn, and the life support devices in the warships were all turned off. All the crew members could only rely on the life support devices built into the power armor. However, the effect was also obvious. As the speed of the Imperial warships moving in the Federation fleet became faster and faster. In just less than a minute, the Federation fleet was destroyed by the Empire's beam blades. Nearly 200,000 warships. These warships that were cut in half by the beam blades bloomed directly in the fleet, and the shields on other warships hit by the debris from the explosion kept flashing blue light. Open fire immediately. Fight back. The commander of the Federation saw that his fleet had suffered heavy losses and shouted in the communicator. However, no matter how he shouted, the weapons of the Federation warships were still cooling and charging. The only weapon that could be used was the close-in defense guns on the warships. However, it was easy to guess how much damage these small-caliber close-in defense guns used for air defense interception could cause to the armor of the Imperial warships. A few minutes later, because the Federation fleet had already reacted, the cutting efficiency of the Imperial warships decreased a lot. In these few minutes, only less than 100,000 enemy ships were destroyed. At this time, the Federation warships finally finished culling and charging their weapons. The Federation warships pointed their guns at the Imperial warships that were constantly passing through their fleet. Tens of millions of shells began to fly across the Federation fleet. Because of the close distance, it was difficult for the Imperial warships to dodge the shells fired from the side, but similarly, the Federation's own warships could not dodge the fire of their own warships. Sometimes the shells passed by the Imperial warships and shot at another Federation warship that the Imperial warships were supposed to block. These flying shells easily tore the shields of their own warships in the Federation fleet. Gradually, some Federation warships began to be destroyed by their own shells. Although these shells had limited damage to the Imperial warships, they were a pit for each shell attack on their own warships. In addition, the soldiers in the warships were pirates and death row prisoners captured by the Federation, and their combat capabilities were not comparable to those of the regular army. Soon these people's crazy shooting at each other began to cause great casualties in the Federation fleet. Warships were constantly blown into sieves by friendly shells fired from all directions, and finally turned into floating debris in a burst of explosions. As time went by, the warships in the Federation fleet became furious and began to become ruthless. As long as the Imperial warships were in a certain position, they would directly pour all their shells over, regardless of whether there were friendly warships or not. At this time, the Federation commander was also a little crazy. Now they could no longer control these death row prisoners. Originally, the condition they promised to these death row prisoners and pirates was freedom, but in this situation where they could be killed by their own people at any time, these death row prisoners had long forgotten the conditions promised by the Federation. Gradually, the Federation warships began to kill each other. They aimed their guns at their friendly forces, and kept pressing the shooting switches in their hands. The shells poured into their friendly warships as if they were free. The commander of the Federation thought it was because they had been killing red-eyed and collapsed in the face of death. But he didn't know the real reason why these death row prisoners went crazy. That was the emotion amplification device carried on the Imperial warships. This emotion amplification device was extended from the technology of the Imperial Yuri Force. By controlling the emotions of creatures, the purpose of making the opponent's battle formation collapse without attacking is achieved. As long as the other party is a creature with a brain, the Empire can use this emotion amplifier to amplify their negative emotions. Chapter 699 Emotion Amplifier. These federal death row prisoners were unconsciously amplified by the Empire's emotion amplifier, which magnified their fear and anger. Now they have lost their minds and are completely controlled by negative emotions. This is exactly the significance of the Empire's research on emotion amplifiers. Even if a different scenario is used, such as when the opponent is at a disadvantage in a battle, once the Empire activates the emotion amplifier, the opponent's fleet may collapse due to the amplified terror. At that time, the Empire can easily encircle and annihilate the enemy warships that are fleeing. While the Federal fleet was killing each other, the Imperial warships quietly slipped aside and entered stealth mode again. No one in the fighting Federal fleet noticed the quietly disappearing Imperial fleet. Even the commander of the Federal fleet has been controlled by anger. He began to think that these death row prisoners deserved to die, and they did not obey his command at all. Now even the flagship of the Federal fleet has participated in the killing. While the flagship of the Federal fleet was firing, it used the ram of the boat to hit the sides of other warships under the command of the commander. At this time, the Imperial fleet quietly surrounded the remaining less than 600,000 Federation warships in the middle to ensure that the Federation fleet would not exceed the range of the emotion amplifier. Continue to increase the power of the emotion amplifier. I didn't expect that the device that was originally used to affect the enemy's combat effectiveness would be so useful. General Fan touched his chin and ordered the officers around him. He didn't know that this was entirely because the crew members equipped by the Federation for this fleet were all death row prisoners and pirates. These people were extremely irritable and easily out of control. After being unilaterally slaughtered by the Imperial fleet, they had a mental breakdown. This also made the effect of the emotion amplifier extremely good. Originally, the emotion amplifier could only affect the opponent's combat effectiveness to a certain extent, but now it directly caused the enemy to fall into a fight. Half an hour later, there were less than 100,000 Federation warships left on the battlefield, and these 100,000 warships were all injured, and none of them were intact. Okay, turn off the emotion amplifier for a while. The Imperial commander suddenly stretched his hand into the air, and the officers hurriedly turned off the emotion amplifier temporarily. At this time, the crew members in the Federation warships, no longer affected by the emotion amplifier, gradually woke up, and their reason took control of their bodies again. At this time, they realized what stupid things they had just done in anger. The battlefield was already full of the wreckage of nearly 900,000 of their own warships, and a frozen or missing body would occasionally pass through the universe. In the Federation flagship that had been almost scrapped, the Federation commander looked at the flashing holographic screen in front of him with some despair. In the battle just now, only 300,000 Federation warships died under the artillery fire of the Sith Empire fleet, while as many as 600,000 Federation warships died under the artillery fire of their own people. The number of warships that died at the hands of their own people was twice as many as those that died under enemy fire. The Federation commander knew that even if he led the fleet back to the Federation, he would be responsible for a major command error, and there would definitely be more crimes that would be put on his head. Compared to being tried by the military court of the Federation with all the charges and being despised by all the citizens of the Federation, it would be better for him to die in this battle and be known as a war hero. Thinking of this, the commander of the Federation gritted his teeth and raised his pistol unwillingly and shot himself. With a gunshot, all the officers in the bridge turned back to look at the commander's seat. Purple blood was spilled all over the backrest of the command seat, and the commander's body drooped weakly. Suddenly, a feeling of deep guilt came over these people's hearts, and they felt helpless, fearful, self-blame and other negative emotions. The officers knew that they had no way out. After setting the flight trajectory that would allow the battleship to hide an asteroid, the officers also took out their pistols and shot themselves. At the same time, in the Imperial fleet, the controller of the emotion amplifier looked at the emotion amplifier on the screen that had been activated again for a few minutes and nodded. The reason why these officers and the Federation commander felt despair and other emotions was because the Imperial fleet had just turned off the emotion amplifier and restored them to normal. After returning to normal, these people will regret or blame themselves for what they did just now because of their out-of-control emotions. At this time, the Imperial fleet once again activated the emotion amplification device, causing these federal officers who were in regret and self-blame to commit suicide one after another. Then, the Imperial fleet turned off the stealth device and appeared from the darkness outside the Federal fleet, tightly surrounding the Federal fleet. Although the Empire only has 18,000 warships, these warships bring only fear to the remaining crew members in the Federal fleet. Those devils are not gone. They are still there. The crew members of the Federal fleet looked at the icon representing the Imperial fleet on the holographic screen in front of them in horror and lost their voices. In an instant, the entire Federal fleet fell into fear. There was no other reason. They remembered the fear of being wiped out by the Federal fleet in one encounter. This fear once again dominated their hearts, and these death row prisoners and pirates collapsed again. However, this collapse was in a more powerful direction for the Empire. These pirates and death row prisoners actually gave up resistance and shut down all the thrusters, weapons, and shields of their warships. At the same time, a surrender message was sent to the Imperial fleet. It was obvious that the fear in their hearts had forced them to give up resistance and choose to surrender. We accept your surrender. All warships should immediately turn off the reactors and wait for our troops to board the ships, the Imperial fleet quickly sent back a reply. Then, 1,000 warships with the Marines and robot troops broke away from the Imperial fleet and flew towards the Federation warships that had shut down the reactors. At this time, the emotion amplifiers were not turned off. It would be a bit bad for the Empire to prevent these people from suddenly becoming hardbones after being unaffected. Anyway, the Imperial soldiers' power armors all have emotion amplifier fluctuation shielding devices, and the emotion amplifiers will not have any effect on the Empire's soldiers. Soon, the Imperial fleet sent the Marines into these surrendered Federation warships. The Marines saw after entering these warships that the crew members of the Federation warships were curled up on the ground with their hands on their knees, and their heads were deeply buried between their knees. When the Imperial Marines took off their helmets, faces that had already cried and were full of despair appeared in front of the Marines. Chapter 700 Rapid Advancement. All enemy ships have been captured. There was no resistance. The prisoners have been gathered in the cargo hold of the warships. After a while, the Imperial fleet received a reply from the Marines. 18,000 warships of the Imperial fleet escorted the 100,000 warships of the Federation back to the forward base. In the next period of time, the main fleet of the Empire will go out to harass the colonies of the Federation. These captured warships will be sent to the shipyard for repair, and after removing unnecessary equipment, they will be used as landing ships and ground support ships of the Imperial fleet. After this battle, the Imperial fleet not only did not lose any warships, but also greatly increased the number of warships in its fleet. The supply lines that were originally somewhat tight also became loose, and the number of troops that the Empire could send to the surface of the planet in each battle became more. With more landing ships, the Imperial fleet can finally let go. The main force of the Empire began to carry out a crazy blitzkrieg. Every time it passed a planet, the Imperial fleet would directly bombard the defense measures and space stations in the star system from a distance to destroy them. Then, after destroying all the enemy's units in orbit, they will start bombarding important military facilities on the ground. After destroying all the Federation military facilities that can be observed on the surface, the Imperial fleet will set sail again and rush to the next star system. The whole process will not take more than 2 days. Within 2 days, the Imperial fleet will resolve the battle and head to the next star system. In this way, including the flight time on the way, the Empire can destroy all the Federation fleets and space stations in a star system every 3 days on average. At this time, the warships captured by the Empire will land on these planets with tens of millions of clone soldiers and millions of mecha tanks. 10 million well-equipped clone soldiers, with mecha tanks and warships in orbit for support, can be said to be unstoppable. Every time the Federation finally organized a counterattack, it would be blown into a pile of debris by the Imperial warships hovering in orbit with orbital cannons. Not only that, the Empire also deployed a large number of piercing drones on these planets. The piercing drones with streamlined design, anti-gravity engines and gravity engines can still maintain extremely high combat effectiveness in the atmosphere, and their maneuverability is no less than that in the vacuum environment of the universe. These piercing drones are not equipped with machine guns or missiles, and they completely use themselves as missiles to launch collision attacks on the Federation's fighters. Its hot melt armor that can melt through the armor of warships can easily melt through their thin armor when it hits these fighters. And their flexible bodies and outer shields allow them to easily pass the distance before approaching the enemy warships. Moreover, the Empire's piercing drones have never acted alone. The low construction cost allows this type of drone to be deployed on a large scale. The number of piercing drones that appear on the battlefield is often several times more than the number of enemy fighters. As long as the black mass of drones presses in front of the enemy's fighter formation, no fighter can escape. Moreover, this type of drone can not only conduct air combat, but also be transported in large quantities to the planets that need to be captured after the Empire's transportation force is sufficient. This type of drone can use gravity acceleration to hit the top of the enemy's armored unit where the defense is relatively weak at high altitude, and directly penetrate the enemy's armored unit. And because the anti-gravity engine used by this type of drone can ignore the direction, these piercing drones can also fly out of the wreckage of the enemy's armored unit backwards and continue to rush to the next target. Now on the battlefields of various planets, you can see swarms of piercing drones cruising in the air. Wherever there is a suspicious target, these drone swarms will rush up and turn the opponent into a pile of ashes. With the help of drones and orbital support, the Empire quickly captured a large number of Federation colonies. Basically, as soon as the Imperial fleet left, the landing fleet would arrive and begin to occupy the planet. When the Imperial fleet destroyed the Federation warships, space stations and military bases in the next star system, the Empire's landing forces almost completed the occupation of this planet and rushed to the star system that had just been cleared by the Imperial fleet. In just 1 month, the Federation had lost 15 colonies, and the resources in these colonies greatly strengthened the power of the Imperial fleet. The transport ships captured from these planets liberated the warships captured by the Empire. These warships can also join the battle, disrupt the enemy's formation from the side, and create opportunities for the main force of the Empire. Just after a month, the Third Imperial Fleet arrived in this river system through teleportation. This time, the Imperial Fleet is still 8,000 unmanned Zeus-class warships and 2,000 large transport ships loaded with supplies and equipment. After the supplement, the number of the Empire's main fleet in this river system has reached 26,000. The new 8,000 warships were separately assigned to a group and launched a surprise attack on the star system of the Federation together with the first group. The combat efficiency of the Empire has increased in vain, and the Federation has lost colonies faster and faster. At this time, the bad nature of this multi-civilization federation was revealed. Because these member states are still independent political systems, these people do not have enough sense of crisis about the invasion of other member states. They think that it is not them who are invaded anyway, so if they lose the colony, they lose the colony, and they can also weaken the power of the civilization. In this mentality, although each civilization is mobilizing fleets, the speed of mobilizing fleets is pitifully slow. Soon, the fleet of this member state began to be unable to hold on. They directly abandoned all the colonies and wanted to fight to the death with the Imperial fleet. More than 800,000 main battleships and more than 2 million battleships of various types gathered in the other party's capital star system. Of course, their intention to fight a decisive battle was unilaterally speculated by the Empire. In fact, this civilization just wanted to keep the capital star system and wait for rescue from other member states of the Federation. After misunderstanding their intentions, the Empire directly gathered 20,000 Zeus-class battleships and rushed to their capital star system. The remaining 6,000 Zeus-class battleships went to occupy the colonies abandoned by this civilization together with the battleships captured by the Empire. 20,000 Imperial battleships soon arrived in the capital star system of this civilization. Unlike other star systems, as the most important political and economic center of this civilization, the other party deployed a large number of fortresses and unmanned artillery in the capital star system. End of this chapter. Thank you very much for reaching the end. Don't forget to like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription, or donation encourages us to continue. Thanks to everyone. See you in the next video.